Hello, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, partners, and friends.
And they're going to be speaking about Africa, about Asia, about Latin America, and the Caribbean, about North America and the Middle East. There's a lot to get through, but I think it's going to be a very informative discussion and session to understand and get some of the ideas and the themes that are coming out from across these nine papers. But first, we're going to hear from Dr. Teddy Sami, sitting next to me, who's going to share insights from a global paper.
I'd like to acknowledge that IDRC's head office here in Ottawa, Canada, where I'm speaking to you from today, is situated on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. This land has been stewarded, traveled, and inhabited by the Anishinaabe Algonquin people for millennia, and their presence and culture have nurtured it since time immemorial. So as many of you know, IDRC has commissioned a series of papers on emerging trends, trade-related trends across the Global South. This has been going on for some months now. And of course, trade is essential for growth and for poverty reduction. But as we know, current threats like climate change, conflict, protectionism, and geopolitical tensions are threatening the current order, and ultimately the benefits that trade can provide across low and middle income countries and actually the world.
Today, we will hear from researchers responsible for writing these articles, who will talk to us about their analysis and share their thoughts. We have scheduled several question and answer sessions to hear your questions and gather your comments.
Our open discussions will surface, we hope, knowledge gaps for further action-oriented research. So in a few moments, I'll introduce our presenters.
But first, I would like to welcome Santiago Albacoral, Vice President, Programs and Partnerships here at IDRC, who will deliver the opening remarks. Santiago.
Merci, Erin. Good morning, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends. Good morning from Ottawa. And a warm hello and welcome to everybody joining us online today. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Trade for Development Engagement Workshop and discussions. But I really want to pay attention to the ones that are making possible this, all the ambassadors, the members of the diplomatic community that are with us, that are online, my colleagues from the Government of Canada, and my friends and colleagues from the International Development Research Center, our speakers, our partners in academia, in the research community, in the civil society, in the private sector, and all the participants that are joining us. I think the last number was over 200 that are already connected online across the globe. This is a very important discussion that we are having here today.
Your presence reflects our shared commitment to addressing the urgent and complex challenges at the intersection of trade, climate action, and development at a time when global collaboration is more vital than ever.
We are really honored to have you with us today, and what I presume is going to be a very engaging and productive half a day of dialogue and exchange. And I want to remark those is about talking, about learning, about sharing. As many of you know, IDRC, the International Development Research Center, is proud of Canada's foreign affairs and development efforts. We champion and fund research and innovation in and with the most developing regions in the world. We aim for global change, for positive transformation. We invest in high-quality research, we share the knowledge that we produce, and we support evidence-informed policymakers to mobilize global alliances to build a more sustainable, inclusive, and fair world.
Given this mandate, today's workshop holds particular significance for us. It offers a valuable opportunity to reflect together on current trends in international trade and their implications for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in the Global South.
The meeting today is not only about dialogue. It's about co-constructing a research agenda that responds to the realities and priorities of those working to improve the lives to vulnerable populations through informed policy and business decisions that benefit all. Decades of experience have shown us that engaging stakeholders like all of you from the outset is essential to ensuring that research leads to a real-world impact.
I believe your presence today signals that this workshop matters to you as well in your roles, your institutions, and your communities.
So I invite you today to partner with us, to engage in the Q&A, to have a conversation, to collaborate, but not to forget a couple of things. We are in a moment where trade is a password, has become a very comment in every conversation, in every decision, in every discussion that we are having. But we cannot forget why we are here. We cannot forget our mandate. We cannot forget our mission. Our responsibility to see beyond the shiny object of the short-term vision. We are bringing responses and visions that look beyond today's problems. And that's where research, development, collaboration has to keep focusing. We are still facing some of the major crises of civilization with climate change increasing, with inequalities increasing, with democracy being affected. Our role is to bring the research, the solutions, the innovations that transform systems that are more sustainable, that are more resilient, that are more fair, and that responds to the most vulnerable communities of the world. IDRC was created for that, and IDRC will continue pushing for that agenda. Today is the moment that we can do the world a better place for all, and we cannot forget that in any conversation that we have. Trade plays a critical role in that discussion, but is not isolated of the rest of the crisis that we are facing. Let me always a very fruitful conversation and in meaningful connections. And on behalf of the International Development Research Center, thank you for being part of this conversation.
Thanks so much, Santiago. I'm going to stay seated now because someone else is going to stand up and speak. But just before that happens, I just wanted to let you know that today we're going to be hearing from nine researchers and research leaders. They are collaborating with co-authors, so the speakers are speaking, but they represent more than just one person. And they're going to be speaking about Africa, about Asia, about Latin America, and the Caribbean, about North America and the Middle East. There's a lot to get through, but I think it's going to be a very informative discussion and session to understand and get some of the ideas and the themes that are coming out from across these nine papers. But first, we're going to hear from Dr. Teddy Sami, sitting next to me, who's going to share insights from a global paper. So this is much more sort of high level. And Dr. Sami, if those of you that don't know him, he is the director of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University here in Ottawa. And his research portfolio focuses on such things as deindustrialization and income inequality, domestic resource mobilization, fragile states, foreign aid, and small island developing states. Dr. Samy is the co-author of the book Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment, Evidence from Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises. Maybe some of you know that book. So welcome, Dr. Samy, and up to you to go up to the podium there if you can. Great.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning for this Trade and Development Stakeholder Engagement Workshop. Thank you, Erin, for the kind introduction, and of course, a warm welcome to you all. This workshop is part of a scoping exercise. Our objective is to identify gaps, evidence gaps, and also pressing policy issues. The goal is to inform a research agenda that lies at the intersection of international trade and development. More specifically, what we've tasked the authors of the different papers and researchers to do is to identify emerging trade-related issues across different regions of the global south. As has been mentioned already, you will hear from them today. They've drafted their regional reports. It's of course tricky sometimes to look at regions and think about generalizing across regions. I mean, we tried to break them down as much as we could, but even within Africa, for example, the north is very different from the south. In Asia, we looked at the East and South Asia separately, and we have one that looks at the region. We separated Latin America and the Caribbean because we didn't think it would be appropriate to group these countries together. But I'm sure even within these subregions, you will often find differences. So, for example, we have a small island states, a few in Africa, for example, that are quite different from the rest. What I'm going to do is step back a little bit and think about some of the global trends and potential areas of research. And the goal ultimately is to also, for me, look at what the researchers found in the regional reports and see whether there's any intersection with what I'm observing at the global level, or whether there are some things that I'm missing. We decided, of course, to have gender and climate as cross-cutting themes across these different issues. And the third objective is to look at the implications for Canada, given the rise of protectionism, nationalism, and geopolitical tensions. I don't know if you can see my slide on this on the screen, but there was a quote on one of the slides that I had, which is a quote from the mandate letter of Prime Minister Carney back in May of 2025, where there's a quote about one of the priorities being about trade, essentially. And you'll see if you read the quote that both the U.S. and other trading partners and allies around the world are mentioned. This is not a surprise for Canadians. The U.S. is our main trading partner, after all. But at the same time, I think it's well known that here in Canada, in the last few months, there's been a lot of discussion about diversifying trade and investment opportunities. So what's the context? I think there's a lot of things that we've learned over the years about the importance of trade. Erin mentioned it earlier, as trade as a driver of growth, poverty reduction, and development. Global trade reached $33 trillion last year. And it was largely, the growth was actually driven largely by services trade more than in goods trade. The interesting thing is that the growth in trade relative to GDP has not yet reached the levels that it attained before the 2008-9 crisis. So there was a time when trade grew significantly, and then since the global financial crisis, it slowed down a little bit, and then, of course, we had the pandemic. So things have picked up a little bit, but they haven't really gained that sort of momentum that existed prior to this. At the same time, the share of developing countries in trade keeps growing. It's pretty significant now, over 40%. We're not very far from, I believe, a 50-50 split, which will be interesting. A lot of this, of course, is driven by China and East Asian economies. So again, you always run into this issue of, looking at the numbers in more detail. So LDCs and countries in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, are very marginal players. And I think that's something that researchers have been paying a lot of attention to. The WTO's World Trade Report the 2024 report also argues that sustained growth becomes possible when open trade happens, but you need complementary policies. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind. So the kind of domestic policies that are needed for structural economic transformation. In trade models, we see those small static gains from trade. So for those of you who remember your Trade 101 class or third-year class in trade and you look at comparative advantage, you see these static gains, which are hard to reconcile with the growth-related changes that we see in economies. And so typically, the way we think about this is that there's productivity growth that goes beyond these static gains from trade in trade models. And here we can talk about increased competition, economies of scale, transfer of technology, industrial upgrading within global value chains. So all of these things together mean that countries that actually are open can benefit significantly from trading opportunities. Unfortunately, not all economies have been able to take advantage of this. So for a number of reasons, and we can look at domestic policy, we can look at foreign trade restrictions, of course, which now are back in full force, weak institutions, too much red tape at the administrative level, poor physical and digital infrastructure in some cases. Remoteness is a problem for some countries. In poorer countries, we know that exporters face challenges that are related to compliance, technical standards, and very often they can't even utilize the preferential access to markets that they have. So even though countries in the global north provide them with access to markets, they are not always able to get their goods where they want. So their production in many cases and their export base is also not diversified enough. So we know all of these things. And then we also have something pretty new now, which is protectionism. I mean, it's always been in the background, but I think now it's really affecting many countries. We are in a tariff war situation in many cases, a lot of unpredictability, nationalism, geopolitical tensions. And this geo-economic fragmentation disproportionately impacts low-income countries that depend heavily on trade because they have very limited domestic markets. They are also disproportionately impacted by climate change, and I think there was a reference to some of my interest in small island developing states. So that's the classic example, and we can also look at LDCs or landlocked countries that are disproportionately impacted by any sort of trade shock or climate-related shock. Another issue that is really affecting many developing countries, and in many ways it's related to trade as well, is the rising debt levels that countries are facing now. I mean, I remember way back when I was a grad student, we worked on the HIPIC initiative in the late 1990s, and there were many initiatives afterwards that were initiated to reduce the debt, and for a while this problem disappeared, but now it's back on the agenda. Everybody now is talking about debt in developing countries. And what does it do? Well, if countries have to service debt, they can't put resources elsewhere, and that has a big impact. And in some cases, they just don't even have enough resources to pay their debt. And of course, what we have seen in the last couple of years is aid donors significantly cutting back. So of course, the dismantling of USAID had a huge impact this year, but it's not just USAID, it's other major donors, the Germans, the Brits, the UK. And of course, we've just had a budget now on Tuesday, and we know that there's going to be, $2.7 billion in cuts in aid from Canada over the next 4 years. So this is going to have major impacts on things such as technical assistance or aid for trade, right? So it is, in a way, related to what we're looking at. If you look at the outcome document of a fourth Financing for Development conference in Sevilla this year, there's an entire section actually devoted to international trade as an engine for development. And I would encourage people to go and read it because it talks about the multilateral trading system, how it's increasingly under threat, why it needs to be strengthened. It also talks about deepening regional integration. And here it talks about technical and regional assistance. But if there's no resources, you can't do it, right? So it talks about reform of investment agreements, measures to address distortions and trade restrictions. So it's a very rich document, but with not a lot of substance behind it in terms of what you're going to do to get to these, for these objectives. So that's the context. It's complicated. it's complex. There are a lot of things happening now that are impacting the trade and development relationship that we had, I suppose, taken for granted for a while because things seem to go pretty well. When we think about these emerging trends, there are obviously different priorities for Canada and various regions of the global south, but I'll try to come up with a list and I will welcome your suggestions and feedback about, and you'll see it in a minute when I present the list for the list of factors that I came up with. But when I was thinking about a possible way of framing this or sort of conceptualizing what we're looking at, it got me thinking about, these triangular relationships that we see in economics all the time. I mean, you've seen probably the poverty, growth, inequality triangle. So, there's a set of interrelationships between these factors. For those of you who studied international finance, there's the trilemma, right? So you talk about, not being able to have all three things at the same time, which is a fixed exchange rate, free capital mobility, or independent monetary policy. Interestingly, Danny Roderick also came up with a political version of his trilemma where he says that you can't simultaneously have hyperglobalization, national sovereignty, and democratic politics. So something has to give. You can't pick two, you can't pick the third one. So when I was thinking about the framing of what I wanted to do for this paper, I thought that maybe I should frame this. So if you can visualize a triangle where each corner, if you will, has something. One of it is policy, so it's the choices that we make. So we can choose regional agreements, we can choose to have a multilateral trading system that works, or we can choose to have tariffs and protection. These are policy choices. They are deliberate. Countries do them, sometimes they collaborate, but you end up with whatever outcome afterwards. The other side, the second factor would be geopolitics, which is now something that we talk about a lot. There's a lot of tensions, for example, between the US and China. The US is turning inward. For my colleagues who come from a political science background, they talk about the rise of global powers or conflicts between these superpowers or a multipolar world. But the bottom line is you have a messy world where geopolitics is affecting everything. And then the third part, so the third side, so corner, if you will, is technology, which is also something that is changing very rapidly and with good and bad effects. And so essentially, if we think about international economic integration, or if you prefer to use the word globalization, you have these three factors now that have amplified over time, if you will. So globalization or international economic integration continues to be affected by these factors. So the rise of geopolitics, it's usually put under security considerations, and these can be catalyzing or they can also impede economic integration. So if you think about, let's say, economic cooperation, where Canada, for instance, or any other country finds strategic allies, and you share the same security and national interests, you have the same political values, that can lead to a good outcome because you can collaborate on trade, on investment issues, and so on. On the other hand, what you can end up with is a fragmented world where, let's say, there's strategic rivalry between the US and China, which we see playing out all the time these days. Or you can have national security concerns that lead to the weaponization of trade and financial relationships. So people now are talking more and more about economic decoupling between the US and China, right? So geopolitics can go both ways, right? It can be positive in some cases or negative. In the case of technology, it's the same thing. You can have technological advances that reduce the transaction costs in trade significantly, and that will facilitate trade and investment flows, and they will also generate new types of cross-border economic activity. But you can also have technology that can be extremely disruptive and that reduce incentives for trade. So for example, if you have automation, which is now something that countries in the global north are talking about as they try to bring manufacturing back to their economies or reshoring, that could reduce the labor cost differences that used to exist and that drove deindustrialization. So if you think about what happened in the 1990s, for example, a lot of industries moved to the global south because the labor cost difference was pretty significant. So deindustrialization happened, and we know that it's partially responsible for rising inequality in the global north, and that created a lot of political backlash. So if you think about the converse now, we have a situation where perhaps some of those manufacturing industries will come back, but they will come back in a different form because they're going to be highly technology intensive, and so you're going to have automation, but they possibly could bring some of these industries back. Artificial intelligence, which we didn't talk about 2 or 3 years ago, right? If you look at the 2025 World Trade Report, they argue that this could increase GDP and trade significantly. So by 2040, if this report is correct, it says that in the case of trade, it could go up by 34 to 37% if you deploy artificial intelligence. In the case of GDP, it could go up by 12 to 13% globally. And that's because you will have these huge productivity gains and lower trade costs. But what the report also mentions is that if you look at the relationship between AI and trade, for this to lead to inclusive growth and widely shared benefits, you also need policies that will bridge the digital divide across countries. So countries in the global south may not have this kind of technology, or at least not at the same level. They will also need to invest in skills so that people can actually use the technology. And you also need an open and predictable trading environment. So on paper, AI could be really an interesting proposition, but in practice, whether you have access to it or how it's being deployed will significantly impact what countries can do. The other thing also, I think, underlying all of this is the impact on jobs, because that's ultimately what's going to happen as well. If you have countries with young populations who are trying to integrate these people into their job market, but then you're automating or you're losing jobs because of technology, is going to have a significant impact. I think this is an area where a lot more work needs to be done, and that could be related to the climate transition as well, right? So the third one is policy, or what I call choices that need to be made, similar to geopolitics and technology. These can be beneficial or harmful. Governments can do a lot of bad things if they reduce, if they impose trade barriers indiscriminately, but they can also reduce them. I mean, it's a choice that they have to make. They can facilitate investment, create better regulatory frameworks, but they can also distort economic flows, as we have seen, through tariffs and non-tariff barriers. They can adopt trade and industrial policies that are discriminatory. And we can also prioritize domestic issues over international integration. Now, these three elements that I've talked about, we can look at them independently, but of course, they are also related, right? So technology affects policy, policy will affect technology, geopolitics will affect technology, vice versa, right? What is different, I think, today, as we speak, compared to the 1990s and early 2000s, is that one, they have accelerated significantly, and two, they have created a much more complex environment where it's not clear yet what the net impact will be. So in the early 1990s, we could argue, and I think it's a fact now that we can put on the table, that the end of the Cold War, democratization happened, geopolitics was much more favorable in the 1990s. Same thing when we look at policy choices. The WTO was created in 1995. China became a member afterwards. Many regional trade agreements were negotiated. We had this period of what is now known as hyperglobalization. So things were actually pretty good. In the case of technology, the ICT revolution facilitated the expansion of global value chains. They led to offshoring, which benefited developing countries. It helped to industrialize in the developing world. So these factors work well. I mean, if you just look at the revolution that happened in mobile technology and the use of cell phones in many developing countries, it was significant for these economies. So what I'm essentially arguing in this global paper is that these three factors actually worked out pretty well in the past, I think. I mean, there's always issues. You can point them out. But broadly speaking, I think these three elements complemented each other. They contributed to a world where poverty numbers declined significantly, where growth happened, with caveats, of course, because not all countries benefited in the same way. What is different today, I think, is that not only have these factors significantly increased, but their impact is much more complex than we think. And I think there are still many questions that we need to answer that we don't have very good answers to, which leads to what you have on the screen, which are these global themes that I have proposed. So these are the 9 themes that I'm proposing. I mean, we can probably come up with more, and I would welcome them, and you can put them under policy, you can put them under technology or geopolitics. In some cases, they overlap more than one. But I think this is where I'm going with this, which is, you can think about geoeconomics and fragmentation of trade and what the implications will be for developing countries. What happens if you can't integrate into global supply chains, for example? Another research agenda could look at productivity and skills and retraining. And you can tie this back, for example, to the impact of technology and what it does to labor markets and so on, right? You can think about industrial policy and state intervention and what happens in developing countries when many countries in the global north are now adopting industrial policies. Of course, to benefit their own interest, but that may go against the interest of developing countries. You can think about macro debt issues and so on, right? So there's issues around inclusive trade, around climate change, critical minerals. So underneath each of these themes, there can be interesting research questions that need to be examined. So to conclude, what I would say for this slide in particular is that you have these high-level themes, but you can look at them, both the macro and the micro implications. So you can drill down and look at, for example, the impact on SMEs, the impact on women, on young people, as these changes keep happening. And the final comment that I would make, and I will end here, is probably there are data implications as well. Because in much of the work that has been done, we always come against this problem of not having enough evidence or data collection, for example, across different groups. I mean, in some of the work that I've done on women empowerment, we know that this is one area, for example, where there's not enough invested in collecting the evidence and the data that would allow for good sort of solid empirical analysis. So the data issue, I think, is something that cuts across, but it's a question of the kind of question that you want to answer and what you're looking for as well. So I will stop here. I don't know if I'm over time. Probably I'm good. So I will stop here, and I think we can leave this slide, or at least if you have a chance to take a look at it for now, and I'm happy maybe to take questions or to share the slides as well, because what I'd like to know in particular is whether there's something that are glaringly missing on the list where you think more research should be done. But I think this is a good starting point. And so the next step now is to listen to the regional researchers and see what they are going to discuss, to see whether there's any overlap or not. And I think that could lead to an interesting research program over the next few years. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Teddy. That was great.
A reminder, for those who are online, you can add your questions in the question box on the bottom of your screens, and in 10 minutes we will answer your questions and raise your different comments.
But now I'd like to introduce to you our next speaker. It's Mr. Bart Idej. I know I didn't say that right. We even had a conversation about it beforehand. So I'm sorry, Bart. Bart is the professor of practice at McGill University and distinguished fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation Canada. Bart has deep experience on multiple aspects of international development policy, cross-border trade, and governance and sustainability. And he is the author of Learning from Tomorrow, Using Strategic Foresight to Prepare for the Next Big Disruption. So he's now going to present his work to date on pursuing Canada's strategic interests, priorities, opportunities in expanding international trade with Asia. Over to you, Bart. I'm sorry for the name.
Aaron, thank you. It's wonderful to have another Montrealer by my side. Santiago, thank you for your fine introduction, and Teddy, you got us off to a very good start, and I think that we're going to see a lot of common themes between what I have to say and your introductory remarks. So to be clear, I'm not diving into one of the specific regions. We're going to get to those shortly. I was tasked with writing a paper providing a Canadian perspective on expanding trade with the Indo-Pacific, examining Canada's strategic interests, priorities, opportunities, etc., related to the expansion of trade with this big region, and giving particular attention to South and Southeast Asia. So in the next 10 minutes, I will share highlights of my paper's initial draft. So in the context of a disrupted, fragmented international trading order, Canada has made a strategic decision to make a pivot toward the Indo-Pacific. And before I continue, I just want to mention, for those who are online, I don't have slides today. You're going to have lots of slides, and so I thought I'd give you a break. But back to the Indo-Pacific, the strategic shift that Canada is making has been formalized by the Indo-Pacific strategy. And so this is not merely a policy preference, but rather an urgent strategic imperative born from escalating geopolitical instability, trade volatility, and systemic vulnerability in Canada's traditional trade relationships. And before I delve into some details, I want to highlight three key points regarding this major economic reorientation. The first is the urgency for trade diversification is driven by pronounced vulnerability stemming from concentrated reliance on the increasingly unpredictable U.S. market. The second point is the Indo-Pacific strategy represents a generational shift to orient Canada's economic efforts toward the world's most dynamic region, anchored by the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, and focused on high-growth markets like India and ASEAN. And the third key point, or takeaway, is that Canada is positioning itself as a stable, as an ethical and committed partner in the Indo-Pacific by systematically linking its trade policy with core Canadian values, including advancing gender equality through its inclusive trade agenda, supporting a multilateral trading system and rules-based order, and championing global climate and sustainable development goals. Now, the global trading system has been undergoing a seismic transformation, and not just with the arrival of Donald Trump in the White House for a second time. And this transformation has been marked by intensifying geopolitical rivalry and the formation and intensification of regional and bilateral trading blocs, as well as President Trump's imposition of tariffs on all U.S. trading partners, as well as a steady erosion of multilateral norms, not limited to American protectionist behavior. So for Canada, this instability has transformed trade diversification from a long-standing policy goal. We've heard about this for decades. It's now an urgent strategic necessity for ensuring national resilience and economic security. The country's economic structure faces significant exposure due to its concentrated export base, with roughly 3/4 of merchandise exports destined for the U.S. While deep integration with the U.S. has offered significant historical advantages, it has also subjected Canada to strategic vulnerability stemming from Washington's increasingly volatile trade policies and, frankly, explicit threats to Canada's sovereignty. Now, this deep vulnerability was acutely exposed in the first half of this year by the implementation of 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum in March, and additional tariffs on motor vehicles in April. Last month, the U.S. imposed 10% tariffs on softwood timber and lumber, and 25% U.S. tariffs on certain upholstered wooden furniture, kitchen cabinets, and vanities. It's hard to keep up with this flurry of new tariffs being imposed. And within the last 2 weeks, we saw President Trump saying that he is going to add another 10% to U.S. tariffs on goods coming from Canada after the province of Ontario aired an anti-tariff advertisement featuring former U.S. President Ronald Reagan. Then, on October 23rd, the U.S. abruptly terminated ongoing discussions with Canada about tariffs and market access. So the impact of U.S. tariffs on Canada has been immediate, and it's been severe. Export volumes from Canada experienced a sharp 7.5% drop in the second quarter of 2025, the largest quarterly contraction in total export volumes since the 2008-2009 recession, excluding the pandemic period. Now, compounding this challenge is the strained relationship with China, Canada's second most important trading partner, which routinely utilizes coercive diplomacy and non-market practices, including retaliatory tariffs on Canadian exports like canola oil and pork. So in direct response to this deteriorating export environment, Prime Minister Carney announced a goal to double Canada's non-U.S. exports in the next decade, a target designed to generate another $300 billion in total trade. So a central objective for Canada is building resilient supply chains, critical for national affordability, productivity, and security. Canada's economy is highly exposed to upstream dependencies, with industries accounting for 1/4 of its economic output vulnerable to external demand and supply shocks. So the strategic response has to involve a de-risking strategy that prioritizes supplier diversification, scaling up domestic production of critical inputs like rare earths, and nurturing partnerships with reliable allies, trading partners in the Indo-Pacific. And domestically, federal legislation like Bill C-5, enacting the Building Canada Act and the Free Trade and Labour Mobility in Canada Act, is streamlining approvals for national interest projects and reducing regulatory duplication to foster a more integrated and efficient national economy. Now, the linchpin of Canada's diversification efforts is the strategic reorientation to Asia. Again, this is formalized by the Indo-Pacific strategy, which was approved 3 years ago. This strategy marks a generational shift to transition Canada from historically dominant north-south trading models to a resilient, globally integrated network that incorporates vital east-west linkages. And the Indo-Pacific region is critical to this shift. That region is home to half the world's population, and it's projected to account for 40% of global consumption and surpass the U.S. economy by 2040. By more than double by 2040. The economic dimension of the Indo-Pacific strategy focuses on high-growth markets, again, like India and ASEAN, which now has 11 members. ASEAN, by the way, is expected to become the fourth largest economy collectively by 2030. So from a trade perspective, the Indo-Pacific strategy is anchored by the CPTPP, and this gives Canadian businesses preferential market access to a number of markets that are generally fast-growing, and it's already had a positive impact on Canadian merchandise trade. So this, to the 7 members, Asia and Pacific members of the CPTPP, we saw a growth in trade of 38% between 2019 and 2023. And complementing this CPTPP, Canada is trying to negotiate a trade agreement with ASEAN and just signed the Canada-Indonesia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, basically a free trade agreement that's expected to come into force next year. Indonesia is the most populous of the ASEAN countries and one of the most populous countries in Asia. Separately and importantly, Canada and India agreed just last month to commence a ministerial level discussion on bilateral trade and investment. So the Indo-Pacific strategy aligns Canada's core comparative advantages with growing Indo-Pacific demand across priority export sectors. And I'll mention 4 briefly before concluding with some remarks about a research agenda. So the first of the 4 sectors I wish to highlight is agriculture and agri-food. And so rising incomes and urbanization are fueling demand for nutritious, protein-rich diets, while climate change threatens the region's food production, and Canada is very well positioned to meet this demand, leveraging high-value products like wheat and pork. And the Indo-Pacific strategy allocates about $32 million Canadian for the Indo-Pacific Agriculture and Agri-Food Office. This is based in Manila, but works regionally to promote higher value Canadian product exports and to resolve non-tariff barriers. The second export area I wish to highlight is natural resources and critical minerals. And here I observe that the global transition to a low-carbon digital economy has created soaring demand for critical minerals, and these are key for example, EV batteries and wind turbines. Canada possesses some 31 critical minerals and maintains high environmental, social, and governance standards. And with these assets, it aims to become a secure, reliable, and green supplier of choice. And this strategy is supported by, among other things, agreements with partners like Japan, South Korea, and Indonesia. Also, Canada is well positioned as a secure supplier of liquefied natural gas for partners in East Asia. So the third broad area of sectoral opportunities includes clean technologies and renewable energy. And here the Indo-Pacific is highly vulnerable to climate change, driving strong demand for clean technology and low carbon solutions. And finally, the fourth area, information and communication technologies and AI. Canada's digital trade faces proliferating barriers, including data localization and mandates for seeding source code. So Canada aims to shape global standards, combat non-tariff digital barriers, and advance freer digital trade. And this is to be achieved by, for example, leveraging the robust digital provisions in the CPTPP and pursuing accession to the Digital Economy Partnership. So this approach will help ensure that Indo-Pacific strategy links economic success with core values. Just a word on inclusive trade. So Canada maintains an inclusive trade agenda to ensure that groups traditionally underrepresented, including women, Indigenous peoples, and SMEs, that they also benefit from global trade. And gender equality is a priority in trade negotiations, as highlighted by the gender chapters in free trade agreements like the CPTPP. I'll just jump here, given time limitations, to talk a little bit about the research agenda. As I've described, the Indo-Pacific presents Canada with significant opportunities in the context of rapid geopolitical shifts, technological disruption, and climate pressures. So to adapt and strengthen its broad regional engagement, Canada requires a forward-looking research agenda to generate evidence that informs policy, and the IDRC should play a key role here. This agenda focuses on 8 key themes that reinforce Canada's economic, environmental, and development objectives. Now, I won't go through all of them now because you're still digesting the points that Teddy had highlighted earlier, but I'll give you just a flavor. Some key areas of this research agenda that I would propose include topics such as structuring development finance to promote sustainable growth, building climate-resilient supply chains, and enhancing digital trade for SME competitiveness. Importantly, future research can explore pathways for inclusive participation by women, by SMEs, by Indigenous communities in both trade and strategic resource development. So in conclusion, the global trading system's seismic transformation, coupled with Washington's unpredictable trade policies, has converted trade diversification into an urgent strategic imperative. And while Canada possesses tremendous inherent strengths, from effective governance to abundant resources, it must address domestic vulnerabilities, such as concentrated north-south trade routes and competitiveness challenges, to fully capitalize on the Indo-Pacific strategy, which is now undergoing a thorough review by Global Affairs Canada. By systematically integrating its economic, climate, development, security, and technology priorities, Canada can solidify its role as a stable, ethical, and preferred partner in the Indo-Pacific for the long term. The three takeaways again: urgency for trade diversification is driven by severe vulnerability that I've highlighted. The Indo-Pacific strategy represents a generational shift to reorient Canada's economic efforts toward the world's most dynamic region. And third, and finally, Canada is positioning itself as a stable, ethical, and committed partner in the Indo-Pacific by systematically linking its trade policy with core Canadian values, including advancing gender equality and championing global climate and sustainable development goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bart. Again, a lot of information to take in. And now we're just going to take some time for some questions and answers. And I've got my colleague, Dr. Flaubert Mbiekop, who's also online. He's in our Senegal office, but he's going to be trying to sort out, to filter through some of the questions online. But I see we've got an eager one here in the room. So do we have a mic?
There's one here. There's one here.
Yeah. Okay, over to you, Steve.
Great. Thanks so much for your presentations. I'm Steve Tipman, Executive Director at Trade Facilitation Office Canada. We're a Canadian-based NGO, not-for-profit organization that works really in the area of supporting small, medium enterprise in developing countries to be able to build their capacity so that they're able to export their goods or services to other markets. It's really using trade to achieve development impact. So you can appreciate that the theme of today's session is very much in line with what we do. I have a couple of, I guess, questions or comments for both presenters. So, you know, Dr. Sammy, you gave kind of an overview of kind of, you know, generalized different thematic areas. And I kind of want to hone in on the inclusive trade aspect because, you know, certainly when we look at inclusive trade, we're looking at helping SMEs, the gender, helping women entrepreneurs is very important, youth as well as other underrepresented groups. But then we've got this, seems like this global tendency, certainly in some areas, some countries, the word DEI is being rolled back. There's all of these, you know, we hear of companies like Walmart, for example, that have, you know, de-emphasized certain elements. And so we're wondering, you know, what are your thoughts on the future as far as this goes? Bart, you talked a lot about inclusive trade and the need for that as part of the research agenda. And perhaps it is that data issue, Professor Sammy, that you said that is just missing right now, that we're lacking the data to be able to make the case for why these things are important. For Bart, you talked a lot about the importance of trade diversification. We're certainly in full agreement with that. I would say that trade diversification is not just about Canada's exports, it's also Canada's imports. While we are very reliant on one country for our exports, we are almost equally reliant on our imports. About 50% of Canada's imports actually come from the United States. And what's interesting, of course, is Canada has free trade agreements with 53 countries in the world today. I'm including Indonesia and Ecuador, and many of them are actually developing economies, so that presents an interesting opportunity, as well as we have other mechanisms like the LDC tariff plus and the GPT plus. That these are all, you know, encouragements for Canadian businesses to take advantage of trade. You mentioned Indonesia. I think there's lots of interesting elements there. You know, there's chapters there around gender, women's economic empowerment, and supporting SMEs. In fact, Canada even has a technical assistance, so money set aside to help promote and help Indonesia to become truly helping to, you know, in this trading relationship. And my last point, I suppose, is you alluded to India, and of course we've seen in the last couple of months a certain rapprochement with Canada-India relations, and maybe if you could lend some thoughts in terms of the importance of that relationship going forward as part of our Indo-Pacific strategy. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I think I've got one more question online, which I will read. It's for Bart, and then you can both answer this first round. So yes, this is for Bart from Ariane Dehan. It's important to describe relative importance. Is it important to describe relative importance of partners? He says he's looking at a table. And probably your paper will make it more clear, that says for Canada, 75% of trade is with the US, and India is surprisingly small, and no ASEAN country among the 15 most relevant ones. How might this impact our choices for research priorities? So with that, let me hand the mic over to you, Teddy, for that first question.
So Steve, thank you for the questions and comments. In terms of inclusive trade, I think despite the fact that we don't have the kind of data that perhaps we need to answer some of the questions, we do have evidence of what has worked and what doesn't. I think one of the things that we learned from the project that we worked on together, is that there's sort of statements that are broadly made that need to be qualified. So classic one is trade leads to women empowerment. Then how do we know? Is it true or not? And when you dig down, you find very often that it's more complicated than that. What do you mean by empowerment? What kind of jobs are women getting? Are they being promoted? Are we hiring women just because there's a deliberate strategy there, or is it because of the nature of a trade or a business that is happening, right? So, and we've found this in many cases that, women are hired because that's the kind of thing that society thinks they should be doing. So it's not a deliberate attempt in any way to empower them. And then when you look even further, you find that, for example, certain people get stuck in certain jobs for a very long time and they can't move. Because so it's a lot more complicated, and I think this is where I think this research really has to go, which is to really understand the decision process, or what is really happening here, and what the counterfactual is, which we always ask, right? What if we didn't have these policies in place? And I think one of the lessons that we learned in that research was that sometimes governments have to be much more deliberate about it, and so you need to have. For example, you were talking about access to finance, I believe, or development finance. Well, you need to have particular strategies that target certain groups that would favor them, right? Otherwise, you're not going to be able to make a difference. So trade finance is an area where I think there could be a lot more done in terms of being much more deliberate and specific about what you're trying to do. The DEI stuff, I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak about this. I guess there is a backlash globally against many of those issues. Probably, maybe I shouldn't say globally. The backlash is happening a lot in the US. In some areas, we're starting to see it even in Canada, in academia, for example, but not to the same extent. So I think it's a bit premature to talk about it. Does it matter? Of course it. If global North countries are the ones funding this, and I think about the U.S. in particular, and their policies against any sort of, inclusion or anything that they deem to be DI related, then of course it has an impact. I don't see this in the Canadian context necessarily, so I'm a bit more optimistic perhaps than others are. But the one thing I would say when we did the work on empowerment in particular is that what we use in terms of terminology and what we define as empowerment is not necessarily something that resonates even in developing countries. They don't, when you interview people and you ask them questions about this, they are always puzzled or they say, what do you mean exactly by this? We're not really thinking about it this way. We just need jobs. We need opportunity regardless. And so it doesn't really matter in a way. So I would say it's more the how we frame it, I think, here that is different in other places. Not to say that it's not a priority, but that people have a different understanding of what it is. And I think we need to be aware of his cultural differences sometimes. Yeah.
I agree with everything he just said, including on DEI. I think that the backlash to it can be overstated because a lot of it is U.S. focused. And let's see what happens in 3 years if the U.S. or has a new president, or in a year or two, and there may be greater balance in the administration there. Anyway, there's always spillover of cultural and political trends in the U.S. and Canada, but we're a long way here away from some of the trends there in terms of diversification, in terms of diversity and inclusion, which remain Canadian values, and as represented in, among other places, trade agreements. Completely agree with you, Steve, about it's not just Canada's exports, which naturally we're thinking of opportunities for Canadian employment and booming business and that sort of thing, and reducing our reliance on just one major economy. But of course, it's always a two-way deal, and that's what FTAs are about. And so there will be opportunities for developing countries as we expand beyond the 50 countries that we already have agreements with, many of which are developed, but many of which are developing or somewhere in between the two. On the question that came from online, I'm not sure if I nailed it or grasped it completely, but it concerned the research agenda, and it was pointed out that Canada's trade with ASEAN, or individual ASEAN countries, and India, they're not in the top 10, and that's true. There's different ways of looking at that, but if you look, I tend to, you had mentioned, Aaron, at the outset, a book I wrote, and that's on strategic foresight, which involves looking at long-term scenarios. So that's oftentimes how I frame things. And if you're looking at what are the parts of the world that are most likely to grow, to boom, to become more important, obviously Asia, but also Africa, which we're going to talk about in the presentations later today. So if we're looking for opportunities, again, coming back to the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN has the highest growth rates, among the highest growth rates in the world, booming middle classes. We have free trade agreements through the CPTPP with a handful of countries there. Indonesia is going to be another one that's not in the CPTPP. It takes a little bit of time to nurture these things. And frankly, Canadian businesses have very understandably taken advantage of this large market to the south. And I wouldn't say it's a matter of laziness. It's a matter of just common sense. It's, for the most part, a common language, a lot of similarities in business culture, easy to export. Well, less so the case now. And so as attention increasingly turns to other markets, and that's starting to happen, I think we're going to see more trade with ASEAN. And India, it seems that there has been a reset in relations, and the very, very low trade compared to other large economies, that's going to almost inevitably rise, assuming that relations stay on a positive level. So to get to the research aspect on that, these are markets of the future, and the future in a lot of ways is now, although somewhat unevenly distributed. I would say look at the opportunities for Canada to enhance trade with not only these countries, but certainly these countries among others, because that's where the growth's going to be. Canada has excellent ties with these countries for the most part, and there are, this hasn't been mentioned yet, but perhaps will come up later in the morning, large diaspora communities. So there are close to 2 million Canadians that have their roots in Southeast Asia. There are, I don't know what the figure is, but it's very large also with roots in India and elsewhere in South Asia. And there are opportunities not just for educational, cultural, and other ties, but there are business opportunities with a subset of those diaspora communities, including with small to medium-sized enterprises. So something else to think about.
Great, thank you. We've actually got quite a few questions online. I'm just going to take one more, and then we'll break for 5 minutes so people can stretch their legs. So this one's directed to you, Teddy. Alors, je vous félicite. J'aimerais savoir si vous avez un indicateur d'inclusion commerciale dans les pays en développement, même s'il y a des difficultés des données. This question is asking whether you have an indicator of commercial inclusion in developing countries, if there are data challenges.
Is this working? I'm not aware of an indicator of commercial inclusion, although it's something to think about, especially if you're trying to compare across countries. I mean, you can have broader you can probably find broader indicators of empowerment. In fact, when we were working on this project that I referenced earlier, we were trying to use some of the World Bank enterprise surveys to look at sort of gender comparisons across countries as they relate to business and trade, and we could never find it. I mean, it's very difficult. The data was not it was not detailed enough to do this kind of analysis, so we ended up doing surveys of SMEs instead. Can we do this? It's possible, but it would require investments. I mean, you can find data on gender broadly, but not as it relates to trade specifically, if this is what the question is asking, right? So for example, even something as broad as, how many women entrepreneurs are there in a particular sector or country, or, how many women-owned businesses you have. It's not easy to find this kind of data from what I know. I mean, there may be people who are working on it. So you can probably find it at the country level for specific issues, but certainly not across countries for broader comparisons, or even over time, right? Which would be interesting. And what was the second part of the question? Sorry?
So the second part of the question was, the data.
Yeah,
data
I mean,
challenge.
it is a big challenge in that area. If you're trying to do the kind of work that we were trying to do, which is to sort of look across different countries, and even the World Bank data enterprise surveys would not allow you for this kind of cross-country comparison, and it doesn't even have a gender, the separation between different groups. So there are data gaps. I mean, but ultimately, I think it's a question also of how much investment you make in these kinds of projects, and you would think perhaps that with technology now we have a better way of doing it, or more cost-effective way, and yet we don't. It is fascinating, actually. I think about this all the time. I mean, we are surrounded by data, and yet here I am always saying we need more and more, right? And it's just incredible.
Well, you have one more quick,
Just to add, like Teddy, I'm also unfamiliar with any indicator of inclusion in trade. However, for the person who asked the question, you might check out the WTO's World Trade Report 2024, which looks at the issue of how to get more people engaged in trade, how they can benefit from trade, and trade as a driver of inclusion. So it's not necessarily an indicator, but they do try to dig in a bit into that issue, which is an important one.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. We're just going to take a five-minute break. So it is 9:45 here in Ottawa. So at 9:50, we'll return back. And in the meantime, I'm going to just see if we can just get the Dr. Teddy's book, because I think we have the link to it. We could probably put it into the chat. So just if people want to dip into that one. I don't know, Bart, if you've got yours ready and online, but we could also share that one too. So we'll meet you back here in just 5 minutes, and there's coffee here in the room for those of you that are here in Ottawa. Thank you. We now have a full hour of presentations coming up, so I'm glad you had your coffee. We're running just slightly behind, but we started a bit late, and we've made up a little bit of time on this short break. So our next speaker is Mr. Stephen Olson. He's joining us online. He is a visiting fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies at the IDRC Institute of International Trade and Finance, and he's also a senior adjunct fellow at the Pacific Forum in Hong Kong. So Mr. Olson is a recognized expert on international trade and also on economic and business issues. He's a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Futures Council on Trade, and the working title of his paper is The Evolving Role of Canada in Southeast Asia. So over to you, Stephen.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, or good evening, as the case might be. It's a real pleasure to join you, and it's a pleasure to be involved in this very important initiative. Now, what I'd like to do, if I may, is take just a few minutes and outline some of my thinking, some of my work with regard to the evolving role of Canada in Southeast Asia. And the starting point for my analysis is the assertion that we're really at a historical inflection point in which many of the foundational principles which have guided Canada's external relations, its role on the global stage, are in some respects either collapsing or transforming themselves in ways that are almost unrecognizable. And there are three particular aspects of this I'd like to unpack for you. First would be the collapse of the rules-based global trade system. Canada helped shepherd this system into existence in the post-war era, and in the decade since then has been a primary advocate for and beneficiary of that system. Then number two, I'd like to unpack a little bit about this backlash, this protectionist backlash against trade, against globalization more broadly that we're seeing, and the rationale that creates for a slightly different approach to trade, to a much more sustainable approach to trade. That's an area, in my judgment, where Canada is well positioned to lead, certainly in Southeast Asia and more broadly globally. And then finally, the third issue I'd like to unpack a little bit for you is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that is the U.S.-China geopolitical rivalry and the really almost somewhat surrealistic evolution that we're seeing south of Canada's border in the United States. So let's take them one by one. Let's start then with the rules-based global trade system. Now, no system is ever perfect, and I wouldn't suggest to you that this system has been, but it's indisputably been a primary driver, perhaps the primary driver of economic development and prosperity, literally in every region of the world, but in particular in Southeast Asia, where we see small trade-dependent economies that will not manage well if we tilt back to a system of law of the jungle, might makes right, and the big fish eat the little fish. Now, certainly, to state the obvious, Mr. Trump's reciprocal tariff regime, his blatant disregard for trade agreements and trade rules, has driven a very big nail into the coffin of that rules-based global trade system. But look, we cannot place all of the blame for this at the feet of Donald Trump. The system was already very badly wobbled before Trump arrived on the scene. There are two primary functional objectives for the WTO. Number one, to be the primary platform driving forward multilateral trade and investment liberalization, updates to the global trade rule books, and number two, to act as sort of a global trade referee. Now, even by admission of the WTO Director General, the WTO has largely failed to deliver on both of those key responsibilities. Partially, it's a result of the success of the WTO. It's got a very large, diverse, 166 membership, and it operates on the basis of consensus. This has made it impossible for the entire history of the WTO since 1995 to even conclude one successful multilateral round of trade negotiations. Just as a point of reference to illustrate the magnitude of the challenge, this is an organization that took years of intense negotiation to reach agreement on the definition of fish. So there are some very real challenges there that have nothing to do whatsoever with Donald Trump. And the dispute settlement system, which is supposed to enable the WTO to act as a global trade referee, that's been disabled largely by the U.S. blocking appellate body judges. Now, an important, maybe a footnote, but an important one nonetheless to make, although this kind of came to a head under Donald Trump's administration, it is not blocking these appellate body judges is not a Trump policy. It is a Barack Obama policy that was continued under the Biden administration and the Trump administration. So this is a system that was in bad shape long before Trump arrived on the scene. Now, the collapse of this rules-based system, in my judgment at least, really creates an urgency for Canada to become more actively engaged in Southeast Asia. These are both regions that have been real stalwart defenders of this concept of rules-based trade. And if there was ever a time for those countries that believe in the principles that we've been operating under successfully for 8 decades to stand up, to work together, to see how they can resuscitate parts of that system that we still believe in. Now is a time for closer working relationships between Canada and the region. And the economic argument, as I think Bart alluded to, is also very compelling. No, ASEAN is not going to replace the US market anytime soon. But in terms of growth rates, they're among the highest in the world, and there's rising middle classes there. So a real strong, compelling rationale for Canada to become more engaged from a trade perspective in Southeast Asia. The second issue I want to talk a little bit about is this protectionist backlash against trade that we're certainly seeing in the US, but by no stretch of the imagination only in the United States, which really points out the need for it to approach trade a little bit differently, to really put a higher emphasis on sustainable trade. This is another area where Canada is well positioned to lead, and well positioned to lead in particular in Southeast Asia. Now, when I talk about sustainable trade, what am I talking about? Essentially, sustainable trade means engaging in international trade in a manner that not only generates balanced economic growth, but also strengthens social capital and provides for environmental stewardship. This derives from the landmark work of the 1987 UN Brundtland Commission, which identified those 3 pillars of sustainability: economic, social, and environmental. Now, Canada scores well across those 3 pillars. It's got a strong, under the economic pillar, a strong physical infrastructure, ports, airports, railways, etc. Under the social pillar, very strong in terms of gender equality, labor standards, educational system, and environmental stewardship as well. Southeast Asia is more of a mixed bag. Singapore scores highly across those 3 pillars, but other countries struggle. So the question is, what is the role in Southeast Asia for Canada further propagating sustainable trade? And I think there's a couple of real interesting questions to look at here. How can Canadian businesses, which are oftentimes leaders in sustainability, partner more effectively with the Canadian government to propagate these principles? What can Canada do in terms of either existing or future trade agreements? Let's face it, it was Canada that was largely responsible for putting the P, or progressive, into the CPTPP. So what kind of a role can Canada play with regional agreements to propagate things like gender equality, better education, higher labor standards, indigenous rights, those types of things? So a number of interesting issues for us to look at there. Finally, I'll say a couple of quick words on that 800-pound gorilla, the intensifying U.S.-China geopolitical rivalry against the backdrop of really a stunning transformation in American governance, American democracy, and America's conduct on the global stage. Now, as I think the Prime Minister has very correctly and very directly stated, Canada's traditional relationship with the United States is over. Donald Trump firmly believes that the deep economic integration that we've been working for decades. Here I can speak personally as a member of the U.S. negotiating team on the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, as well as the NAFTA agreement. And Bart was also kicking around on those issues as well when we both started our career in Washington, D.C. about 100 years ago. But that deep continental economic integration that we for granted as it being mutually beneficial, Trump thinks is a bad deal and is working very aggressively to try to undo that. And of course, we've got the geopolitical rivalry with China, which is playing out prominently in Southeast Asia. So this raises a number of questions: how Canada interacts in the region in light of this, and in particular, as we move towards the review, and what I'm presuming is going to be a renegotiation of CUSMA, the Canada, US, Mexico Free Trade Agreement, because Trump is clearly trying to create a fortress North America. He's clearly trying to build high walls against Chinese inputs and even Chinese investments in Mexico that might end up in products being shipped into the United States. This is going to immensely complicate life for Southeast Asian countries which participate in supply chains, which will be directly or indirectly impacted by whatever these three countries agree during the review of CUSMA. So a number of important issues for us to unpack here. I just wanted to briefly touch on some of the key points, but I'm mindful of our time constraints. So I'll bring my comments to a close there, and I'll look forward to any comments or questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Stephen. You made me think of my undergraduate days speaking about the Brundtland Commission and our common future. So thanks for that memory down memory lane. Wonderful. So we will have Q&A afterwards. So please, if you do have questions, which I'm sure you do, you can put them in the Q&A session, and we will try and get to them at the next piece. So je vous rappelle. Et je rappelle à notre public en ligne de mettre vos commentaires ou questions dans la section de questions-réponses. Nous y répondrons dans quelques instants après notre prochain intervenant. So our next speaker is Dr. Mitendu Palit, who's a senior research fellow at the Institute for South Asian Studies at National University of Singapore. We'll just wait for his image to pop up here on the screen. So while that's happening, I'll just tell you a little bit more about Dr. Palit. So he's an economist specializing in international trade and investment policies, geoeconomics, Asian connectivity, regional political economy, and the Indian economy. He's also an adjunct faculty with the Center for WTO Studies in Delhi, India, and he's the author of many books, so I won't read them all out to you. The working title of his paper for this scoping exercise that we've been undertaking is Canada and South Asia, Engaging to Enhance Economic Security Amidst Disruptive Global Trade. Dr. Palit, are you actually I think you're not in India at the moment, right?
Well, I'm actually joining from India right now.
Oh, you are. So I'm so sorry. It must be very, very not a great time of day. So thank you so much for being flexible and joining us here at Ottawa time. But anyway, over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Irene. And I'm actually better placed than Steve, who's joining in from Southeast Asia, I think, right now. So, one leg up on that, you, Stephen. So thank you so much. I have some slides to share, so I'll be grateful if the slides come up on the screen. So that's the title slide that I have for the work that I've been doing. That's Canada and South Asia engaging to enhance economic security amidst disruptive global trade. Could we move on to the next one, please? Now, out here, I think I'll just briefly touch upon the context that we have running up into the work that we did. It's been about a 2.5 months exercise that we have been pursuing till now. And I think what's happening out there is, as my previous commentators have mentioned, there's increasing securitization of trade policy in the sense that security is becoming a key element of looking at how trade relationships should come up between various countries of the world. Now, this is something which is clearly a completely different set of new challenges for the global south, and the South Asian region epitomizes these challenges for the very simple reason that this is one part of the world which is not just heavily populated, but it is also pretty weak in terms of regional integration, has a lot of structural deficits, so as to talk about, in terms of limited capacities of institutions, heavy incidence of climate change issues, social development problems. There are ethnic conflicts going on in various parts of the world. And I think when it comes to this kind of a condition where trade deals are being cut through a security prism, there's a great impact on economic security of the region, both in terms of the national context as well as the household or individual context. And that's something which is central to the paper that I'm looking at. Next slide, please. So I'll just very briefly touch upon what are the insecurities that are arising from a typically caution attitude that we are getting to see. So the Liberation Day tariffs, and they continue to remain in operation for most countries of the region, especially India, and they have meant huge job losses for a number of employment-intensive industries, especially apparels, leather, and so on and so forth. But there has been a very strong race among the countries of the region for getting the best cuts on the initial tariffs that were announced. And these cuts have come for a large number of countries in the region, but they have come at fairly high prices. And in fact, this is something which is important to note, that countries that have got deals with the US going on till right now, like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, are all economies which are fiscally stressed and running on IMF support. And the other point that's important for these countries to consider is that anything that is being done with respect to the United States by these countries also means there has to be a China impact, and they must brace for that impact as well. And maintaining a distance is a costly proposition because it might mean getting left out of the supply chains. Next one, please. I think one of the critical problems that the region now faces, and that's basically squarely an outcome of the disruptive trade policies and the disruption in global trade order that we are getting to see, is the setback for decarbonization. Now, the US backout has meant that in frameworks like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, where the clean economy pillar was a very important pillar for bringing in finance from a variety of sources, including public-private partnerships, is no more really active the way it was. There are problems that countries, in their efforts to diversify to other markets, can actually push their exports to markets which don't really have very standardized emission norms, so they don't get to actually follow those norms back home in production. And when it comes to critical minerals, a number of countries in the region, notably Pakistan and Bangladesh, have actually started inking deals with the United States on critical minerals. But as reports show, they're getting tied to ostensibly high trade-offs, especially on the area of military security. And in the meantime, they all have to counter with China's rare earth export controls, which are specifically demanding explicit guarantees that there will not be re-exports. So that kind of puts them in the bind. But on the other hand, there's also protectionism on carbons coming up in the other part of the world. So the European Union, for example, is one area where there is a lot of diversification prospect that South Asian economies are looking at. But they all have to now adjust to the possibility of carbon border taxes, while the biggest country in the region, India, has been able to accommodate its carbon trading scheme within the carbon border tax framework of the EU. It's not happened with the other countries, and there are concerns over whether the US will come up with something like the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, which might again mean that there are distortions and unintended diversifications in trade in might occur. But there's also this other silver lining coming up, that if the US is eventually backing out in the way it has, from the global efforts to back decarbonization, might it create the ground for other global actors to step in, and might it be easier for South Asia to cooperate with them in that respect? And that's probably where Canada comes to have an important role in the scheme of things. So one of the issues which I think came up in the issues that Sammy had illustrated in the opening conversation is that South Asia, and this I come to from a regional perspective, there's a critical issue that's happening with respect to the availability of skills. And it is not just a question of the emergence of EI. It's also a question about the fact that training curriculums in most of the technical institutions of the region, including in India, have not really changed the way they should have in order to accommodate the very major transformations that are taking place in industrial production. So now if AI is posited against this transformation, then probably one needs to look at how training curriculums can be updated for the perfect human-machine collaboration. But if it is not, then what is actually happening is that what is technically called the workforce ready populations in this part of the world, which has the largest young population in the world, the workforce ready populations are clearly not skilled for 21st century work. And that might actually lead to a situation where the demographic dividend of the region, and for most countries, might actually turn out to be a demographic liability. And on top of that, there are H-1B visa issues trying to bring in selective mobility restrictions for skilled professional, which again are going to aggravate the skills deficit in terms of the mismatch and their utilization. This is something where I'd like to devote a little bit of time in terms of what I essentially consider is the way forward, and especially the Canadian engagement. And I'm glad that Bert actually reflected a little bit on these as we spoke. So I want to break this down into two parts. One is that when the Canadian engagement comes with respect to the rest of the region, that is South Asia, I suppose we need to be very cautious about the fact that India is overwhelmingly large in this part of the world, and it's almost 80% of the region, both in terms of its economic presence, geographic size, as well as the population. So there are probably two ways in this engagement needs to be separated. One is an engagement which is especially with respect to India, and the other is in terms of the specific issues that we have identified, especially decarbonization and skills, which can be taken forward with a wider outlook with respect to the region. Now, the strategic concept of an engagement with India is surprisingly a very benign context at this stage, because both Canada and India find themselves in somewhat similar conditions as far as the US tariffs are concerned. They continue to remain among the highest US tariffed countries in the world. The Indians are now struggling with a 50% tariff. Canada is not too far behind. And the urge to diversify on part of both countries has been very prominent. Canada has been engaged in a large number of FTAs, including the economic program with Mexico, the free trade agreement with Indonesia. And India, on the other hand, has been very active. It just got on with a free trade agreement with UK. It's in a very advanced stage of concluding a free trade agreement with the European Union. And the India-Canada FTA is again going to be taken up for revival. So the short point over here is that there are a lot of common connections as far as trade-related rules-based frameworks are concerned between India and Canada, and both in their own ways are probably large economies which can be characterized as benign progressive middle powers in terms of their shares in global trade, which are roughly between 1 to 4% of global trade, something, a terminology that DGWTO has brought into the trade conversation to define middle powers. And this is where India and Canada can actually try exploring new ground. So we already had Bert and Steve talking about the CPTPP. I think there is a considerable opportunity for India now to be brought into this conversation on CPTPP as a prominent middle power. And the CPTPP is no more just an APEC grouping. It's expanded well beyond that, and probably it can enlarge even further to go into South Asia. And if there is scope for middle power activism for supporting the global rules-based trade through an architecture like the CPTPP, then why not? Probably that's something where both countries can collaborate together. I'd like to put out a couple of thoughts on the decarbonization prospect. I think there are considerable opportunities for Canada and India especially, as well as the rest of the region, to work closely on decarbonization. One of the issues that I think can be taken up in this consideration is the working together on green shipping lanes, on green corridors. Canada has a very advanced domestic rules framework in this regard. India is working very actively on this with countries like Singapore and Australia in the Indo-Pacific region, and there is every possibility for both of them to bring the rules-based frameworks together and to make sure that they are able to address the emission issues in the maritime sector through prospective collaboration in a more effective fashion. And finally, I think when it comes to addressing the skills deficit, the Skills Council of Canada and the National Skills Development Corporation of India have already been working together closely on a large number of subjects, but probably those collaborative projects now can be further enhanced in line with the specific disruptions that are getting to be seen around both Canada, India, and the rest of the countries, especially in terms of areas like green skills development and so on and so forth. Now I move to the last slide, please. Well, I think this is where I would like to just briefly contribute to what has been a part of what Teddy has mentioned till now, and also Bert and Steve, in terms of what might be the core elements of a research agenda that might need to be fleshed out as far as Canada's South Asia engagement is concerned. I think I totally agree with Steve on the point that this is probably a critical juncture, strategic juncture, where Canada, in terms of its reputation as a benign global power, can actually effectively try linking up and breaking barriers by engaging with South Asia as well as Southeast Asia. And there are a lot of win-win outcomes to be obtained from over there. And I think as far as South Asia is concerned, and here I sort of look at it from a broader regional perspective, I think South Asia would clearly be looking forward to such kind of an engagement, because that would help it in mitigating the downsides of the US-China rivalry. And stay focused more on the development agenda, which it is not often being able to do because it is having to handle the negative externalities of the US-China rivalry. For Canada, one of the very strong benefits of greater engagement with South Asia is getting a deeper strategic foothold in an exceptionally geoeconomically significant region of the world, which has clearly durable long-term benefits. And South Asia would look forward to such kind of a foothold as something which would give it greater support and greater assurance as far as regional economic security is concerned, as far as greater engagement with Canada as a benign global power is concerned. Insofar as this larger context is concerned and the specific issues that might feed into a broad research agenda, I think some of these have already been mentioned and just will briefly touch upon. Food security, I think, is an important subject, especially as one looks at the management and resilience of food supply chains, similarly for healthcare, digital trade, green trade, and innovation. And finally, the overarching theme of Canada's role as a global middle power in the Indo-Pacific region, and how it can utilize compacts like the CPTPP to expand its outreach and influence through greater engagement with South Asia. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Palit. Really, so much to unpack there. I'm taking lots of notes. Really great presentation. Just in terms of time, I want to carry on. So our next speaker is Dr. Yasmin Essa. She's assistant professor at the Department of Economics at the American University in Cairo. Dr. Essa's research interests are at the intersection of global value chains, innovation, and labor markets. Her studies are focused on emerging regions and are published in peer-reviewed journals on international trade and innovation. And she's received multiple recognitions for her work. So she's currently co-authoring a paper for this series with Samer Atalla, the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies and Research also at the American University of Cairo. The paper that they are working on is called The Role of Trade in Advancing Gender Equality and Climate Action, the Case of North Africa. So welcome, Dr. Essa.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the floor and for the extended introduction. I'm not sure if the slides will show, or should I resume without the slides?
We don't have the slides just yet.
Okay.
Just one second.
So I might start by saying that, as you have said, I'm working on international trade interlinkages and regional trade agreements, and we are very happy to be working on this project now that we are in a very uncertain time, but it's also a very interesting time. We are still basing our research on the continuation of the rules-based system, and we are still believing in the multilateral system. And in this paper, we are focusing on the North African economies, and we are picking two of the challenges of the regions, being the gender equality and climate action. Before we start, I would just like to give you a glimpse of the North African region. We have to mention that the region is located in a very strategic position, and this is one of the reasons why it matters greatly when it comes to international trade. The region accounts for 3.7% of global trade, so the $33 billion that the trade is contributing with, the region is contributing by 3.7%, which is not little. And the main trading partner is Europe. The region is more integrated with the EU than with its neighbors in Africa. However, we still have an accountable trade volume with Asia as well. The region is rich in the resources, and when we mention resources, we don't only mean the natural resources, oil and fossil fuels, but also it is rich in the solar energy, the wind energy, and the young population, which is giving it a lot of opportunities to reach multiple goals, like the labor market outcomes. However, we are also faced by challenges regarding the job creation, and it is one of the main priorities now in multiple countries, the job creation, not only in terms of quantity, but in terms of quality as well. Next slide, please. Yes, when we are working with the 5 largest economies in the region, we thought of dividing the 5 countries into 2 main groups. So the first group, composed of Algeria and Libya, are still at this point in time dependent on oil and fossil fuels. So we still have the more than 90% share of oil in exports. And this, of course, this intensity of oil dependence is always coming with weak quality of institutions, vulnerability of output, and also more vulnerability also in the shocks, in the world shocks and the world crisis. And then we have the diversifying economies, Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco, and these countries are really doing great efforts in terms of the transition to green energy, and especially Morocco. Morocco is leading in the green transition, having more than 40% of its power energy now from the renewable energy. And what is also important when we speak about Morocco is that it is the only country that was able during the last 20 years to have a positive number of the quality institutions. So because of multiple problems that the region has been facing, the quality of institutions is declining, and mainly the regulatory quality. However, with the exception of Morocco, again, it is the only country that was able to do a positive growth in the quality of institutions. Next slide, please. So we are focusing on the gender dimension, and we are not saying that the labor market outcomes are having the most challenge is only in the employment of women. Again, we are having a problem in the job creation in terms of quantity and in terms of quality. However, when we check the unemployment percentage for the region, we don't see the problem. We only see the problem when we see the employment, the working force participation rate. And we see also the problem when we compare between men and women. So in terms of employment, men are 5 to 6 times more having higher probability of getting employed. The gender gap is there in the employment opportunities, in the wages, and also in the entrepreneurial activity. So we can see that the region is having the lowest data in terms of the female labor force participation. This is what we can find in the World Development Indicators, and the numbers that we can see are lowest compared to the other regions or also other peers in the category of the middle income countries. And therefore, we decided to focus on that, given the fact that the economies are doing great efforts in order for the women to have higher reach of either education or healthcare. However, this is not reflected in the labor market outcomes and the probability of getting employed. Next slide, please. So here we are having just the stylized fact as an example to what extent is trade linked to this gender paradox. And we are basing here the data on the diversifying economies, the 3 countries that are doing the transition, as I mentioned in the beginning. And it's based on the World Bank Enterprise surveys. And what we can see is actually that if trade is positively linked to the employment of women, and here we can see that only in 2 countries, Morocco and Tunisia, where the share of women employment in the exporting firms exceeds that of the non-exporters. However, for Egypt, we don't see that. We see that the percentage is almost the same on average. Again, we need to mention that Egypt is focusing on types of activities that are not really female-friendly, like the construction sector, for example, coupled with mitigators in the business environment. However, we will not be sure what is exactly the reason that this effect is not happening in Egypt until we consider all the conditions, like the access to finance, for example. Egypt is also facing fiscal pressures. So 10% of the GDP is going into the interest payments because of the foreign borrowing. And this is something that could be interesting to further explore. What are the mitigators, or why is the trade effect or the promises of trade in terms of equality is not clear when we see the Egyptian data, especially that Egypt is, again, among the countries that are doing the diversifying efforts and the transition. Next slide, please. The second pillar that we want to focus on is the climate risk, and this is not, of course, specific to North Africa. It is a general risk. However, because again, we are still having a group of countries that are at this point having the majority of the exports in fossil fuels and hydrocarbons, then we have an internal risk. And the external risk is coming from the carbon taxes that will be implemented in early 2026 on 6 main sectors. And given that Europe is the main trading partner of the region, given that we are accounting a lot on Europe in terms of the development provisions in the regional trade agreements, we are not yet sure whether this would be an opportunity for the region or rather a threat, because the 6 sectors that the carbon taxes would be applied on is also within the sectors that the region is exporting. The cement sectors, fertilizers, as well as aluminium. So we are not sure whether this will decrease the competitiveness of the region in terms of the volume of exports or not, but we are witnessing. And if this is an opportunity, then it will be an opportunity to increase the efforts towards the green transition and the renewable energy. Again, this is constrained with the finance access. Again, mentioning the fiscal pressures that the region is facing. This is not an easy job to do. And can we move to the next slide, please? The countries are different, as I started in the beginning, and therefore the exposure to risk is also different. The leader of the country is Morocco, having the highest share of the renewable energy use in electricity and in power in general. And of course, the least in terms of investing in renewable energy are the highest exposed, the oil-dependent countries, or Algeria and Libya. Whether the transition for these countries is easy or not, this is, of course, something that we need to work on. How can the agenda be clear for these countries, since they are now forced to do the transition, given that they are not investing in the innovation, given that the R&D expenditure is not increasing because of the oil dependence. So these are the two countries that are having the highest risk in the region. And we're coming to the last slide. We are trying to pick up on the research questions that we would like to further explore. And as I said, we would like to see the effect of trade policy. To what extent is the trade policy friendly in terms of these two dimensions or these two pillars in the region? Again, when we speak about trade policy, we are not only talking about tariffs, we are also talking about the non-tariff costs, the cost of trade, and Egypt is doing a great effort in decreasing the cost of trade and decreasing the number of the procedures and the processes for the licensing of exporting. We are doing the single window initiative. Still, we are not sure whether the implementation of this would be positive, or maybe it will further increase the time for doing the license. However, the efforts are there. The multilateral system, again, the policymakers are still going towards this direction, engaging more in trade integration, more in regional trade agreements, decreasing the trade costs, the facilitation of trade. All these are efforts that are really happening in the region. And we would like to see what are the complementary policies that are necessary given the tensions of, again, the fiscal pressure. And I'm repeating that because it is one of the main issues in a country like Egypt. And how can the rest of the world and the rest of the trading partners share in this progress regarding the job creation, enhancing the opportunity of getting employed in a good quality job, not only increasing the number of jobs available, and how to make use of the advantages of the region, being it the young population abundance, the solar energy that is here all the year. And these are the two proposed questions that we would like to work on with. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Issa. I see now we've got our web people giving a very subtle signal to that the time of the speakers is up. It's so hard to be able to summarize the in-depth work that you've done in 10 minutes. So thanks so much for trying. I think you did a really great job. Let's see. Alors, nous allons avoir notre dernière intervenante pour cette partie de l'atelier. Ensuite, nous tiendrons notre prochaine séance de questions-réponses. Alors, je vous invite à poser vos questions dans la section des questions-réponses si vous assistez à l'atelier en ligne, s'il vous plaît. And now we're going to welcome Dr. Verena Tendrayan Raghuboor. She is an associate professor in economics and WTO research co-chair at the University of Mauritius. She's also the dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities. And she currently heads the Pole of Research Excellence in Applied Social and Economic Research Analysis at the University of Mauritius. And she's published in international peer-reviewed journals. And the working title of her paper is Trade for Development in SADC, the Southern African Development Community, Policies, Priorities for Inclusive and Climate Resilient Futures. Alors, je vous souhaite la bienvenue. We don't see her on the screen yet, but...
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for the nice introduction. Yeah, I can see the slides now. The paper is on trade for development in SADC countries, and basically looking at climate change and also gender perspective. Next slide, please, is on the emerging trade issues, which I have been focusing on. First of all, the first aspect is looking at regional integration and the AFCFTA implementation within the Southern African region. The second theme, which was selected, is agri-food trade and climate resilience. The third one is more about critical minerals and the green transition, while the fourth theme is on gender, trade, and inclusive growth. Now, why these themes were selected? Basically, to look at the main challenges within the SADC region. And as you know, the SADC region is house a mix of countries, middle-income countries, low-income countries, as well as fragile states. So it's a diversity of countries there with both challenges and opportunities. So the paper basically look at the structural and institutional obstacles for greater trade and deeper integration within Southern Africa, within the SADC region, and highlight how the AFCFTA can unlock trade opportunities in the region. This is within the first thematic. Then we know that many countries within the SADC are highly vulnerable to climate change, and at the same time, there is a high dependence on the agricultural sector. So we examine the exposure of Southern African countries to climate change and how climate change affects trade in the region through its effect on the agricultural sector and agricultural productivity. The other dimension is looking at minerals, and Southern Africa minerals ecosystem is rather broad in the sense that we talk about the pattern of mineral trade, but also green transition. The aspect of gender is very important when we refer to trade and development, and especially when we talk about sustainable, inclusive growth. And we know that women participation within Southern Africa in trade is in informal trade mainly, where there are many gendered barriers to participation. Next slide, please. So I'll be looking first at regional integration, and we all know that regional integration within Africa, intra-African trade, is rather, it is growing, but still remains below potential. Though from the chart there, you will see Southern African trade is much higher compared to other regions within Africa, but still intra-African trade remains low for a number of reasons, like regulatory inefficiencies, inadequate infrastructure, conflicting local trade policies, burdensome border procedures, unreliable transport networks, etc. So there are so many challenges which economies within the Southern African region face and which prevent intra-African trade. So if we look at intra-African trade in 2024, it has been much higher, slightly higher compared to 2023 and 2022. And among these 10 exporters, the top 10 intra-African exporters, in fact, 5 are from the SADC region. So there are potential to improve intra-African trade within the region. And of course, among these 5 SADC countries there, which top up the 10 intra-African exporters, South Africa topped the list. Then the second thing that we look at in the next slide, please, is agri-food trade and climate resilience. We know that Southern Africa depends a lot on the agricultural sector. It contributes around 70% of the region's GDP, and in around more than 60% of its population depends on agriculture for their livelihoods, but there are still many challenges there. First of all, the agricultural sector is seen as a major engine for economic transformation, job creation, better livelihoods of people in the Southern African region. There are a number of barriers, challenges there in terms of inadequate infrastructure, food insecurity, limited technical capacity, climate vulnerability. In fact, SADC countries face a high climate vulnerability. And above all of that, they also lack the coping strategies to face increased temperature, intensity, and frequency of extreme weather conditions, which affect the agricultural sector in the southern region. So, can trade be used as a tool to mitigate these environmental impacts, especially for the agricultural sector? How can SADC countries boost their coping strategies in order to reduce their vulnerability to climate change? The next element is about critical minerals and green transition. Many countries within SADC have a huge amount of minerals located in Southern Africa. But again, there are many constraints, and these are not new challenges. There have been challenges which have been there for decades, we will say. And there are ways of moving forward with investment from other countries and with greater support from different countries, and especially the development of value chain within the sector. But with the development of mineral value chain, we should also bear in mind ESG frameworks, which need to be improved and implemented to guide green minerals use. Because though critical minerals presence is very large in the SADC region, value addition remains very low. And in fact, when we look at the region, the continent as a whole, Africa received only around 2% of global green clean energy funding in 2023. So there is much more to be done there for the SADC region. The next slide, please look at gender, trade, and inclusive growth. This is the next thing that is covered in the paper, because when we look at trade, informal trade is very important for the Southern African region. Approximately 50% to 60% of total intra-African trade is informal, with informal cross-border trade contributing to 30% to 40% of total intra-regional trade in the SADC region. And a large part of the traders are women. And basically, they face a number of challenges there. In terms of access to finance, standards compliance, mobility constraint. There are a number of gaps, whether it's institutional gaps in customs, etc., standards alignment. So in that case, they face these challenges which constrain the trade potential which exists there. So the gender dimension is very important whenever we talk about inclusive growth and especially improving the livelihoods of these women operating in the informal sector. So there is still much more that we need to know. In the next slide, what are the key gaps in future research? We look at it from a macro perspective, a sectoral perspective, but also at a micro level. Data is an issue when it comes to the micro level. At the level of macroeconomic impact or gains, there is a need to look at the macroeconomic gains and sectoral impact of the AFCFTA. Of course, this is still going on, and we need to see the impacts of the AFCFTA in the Southern African region. What are the impact, what are the gains, and how the AFCFTA links up with other policies which governments are implementing in order to make the most of it and in order to increase the potential of the AFCFTA for the region. The next one is sectoral gap, because we focus on agriculture and we look at to what extent the agricultural sector is vulnerable to climate change. So a vulnerable mapping could be something of agri-value chain, could be something that we could look at in terms of which crops, which regions are more at risk to climate change and how it affects the agricultural sector and livelihoods of people. At a micro level, we've seen from the data that women are mostly in the informal cross-border trade across Southern Africa. So quantitative analysis looking at the size of the women's informal cross-border trade is very important to come up with policies in order to reduce these challenges that they are actually facing. When we talk about the mineral sector there, what are the social labor dynamics in green mineral sector, gender participation, decent work, and also another level of analysis at the micro level is looking at firm level readiness for the AFCFTA. We've been talking a lot about the AFCFTA, but are firms ready? How can they benefit from the AFCFTA, especially MSMEs and especially women-led MSMEs? So the gender dimension there is also important so that women are not left behind. So basically, these are the themes of the paper and also future research which can be done with available data, whether at the macro, micro, or meso level. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Verena. That was a really excellent overview of a huge region, the SADC region, which is very diverse. And I really appreciated your concentration on the gendered aspects of trade in the region and some of the opportunities, etc. So we are now just going to take a few minutes to have a bit of a Q&A. I've kept poor Teddy up here and Bart, but just because I didn't want the stage to be empty. But again, like if there are other questions for them, they're here as well. So I don't know if there are any questions in the room to start with. Anybody here? Or we've no. Yeah. Okay. Colleen, go ahead.
Yeah, great, thanks. Thanks, really, really interesting presentations. I'm looking so forward to seeing the final papers. I'm Colleen Duggan, team leader with our Sustainable Inclusive Economies program. One thing I just wanted to flag, and Prof. Sami and I talked about this a bit in the break, is I really feel like infrastructure and transport and mobility are emerging as really key enabling sectors. Just when I think, for example, like the shutdown in the United States right now, freight is not moving, airports cannot function. It just feels like a little bit of a gap for me. So I'm kind of hoping that we can pull some of that out as we move this work forward. So more of a comment, I guess, less of a question. What I did want to say vis-a-vis Yasmin's excellent presentation is, are there any other sectors aside from those that you did sort of identify that you thought were sort of outliers or directions that we could go in? Or would you really, for example, in sectors like things like transport and mobility, recognizing women are shut out of certain labor markets in this part of the world, what are the most promising places for us to push towards?
Great. Let me just take another couple. I've got one here in the room, and then I'm going to take a couple of from online. I just need the mic there.
Thanks. Maybe more of a comment than a question. It's just so lots of great inputs here. I just wanted to maybe encourage also the role of the private sector. We've heard a lot about policies and establishing policies. And so one example, for example, in the SADC region, it's the Southern Africa Food Systems Alliance. They have an ambitious goal of 80% of total viable sourcing in agriculture and food products to be sourced within the SADC region in 2033. And that's really an initiative that's very much spearheaded by the private sector. So it's just something just to consider as you're going through these public private dialogues can certainly uncover some interesting results. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll just take one online and then I'll go to you, Martha, in the room. This is well, gosh, there's so many. We have a question from Wissam on female labor force participation rates and how, unfortunately, they're not taking into account the informal economy, which is a huge part of North Africa. This is actually a missed opportunity to quantify the actual contributions. How are you taking that into account? And then I'm going to just put in one more for Dr. Asa. I'd like to begin by congratulating IDRC. Okay, you mentioned that that exporters tend to hire more female workers in 2 of the research countries. I was wondering whether your research captures the types of jobs these women hold. In other words, where in the value chain they are primarily employed. There is evidence in the literature showing that as value chains become more skilled and more technology intensive, the share of women tends to decline, and women are often concentrated in lower productivity segments of the value chain. So I'm interested to understand whether your data reflects this, and if so, how we might interpret the implications for women's actual empowerment and gender equality, because not all participation in trade, as I think Dr. Teddy was saying, automatically results in equitable outcomes for women. So let me just start with those ones. Our speakers. Dr. Asa, are you able to answer that one there?
Yes. Yes, I can start.
You can start with that one.
Thank you very much for the insightful questions. Regarding the sectors, we are focusing on the sectors that we have data on in the World Bank Enterprise surveys. Of course, as I said, the concentration in the infrastructure and the construction activities limits the opportunities for women. For the tradable sectors, we find that the garment sector is the one that's having the highest share of women employment. Also for the entrepreneurial activity, the positive correlation between exporting and the higher share of women ownership is happening more for the garments and the textiles and the apparel sectors than it is happening in the chemicals, for example, sector. So we can say that so far we have evidence that the concentration is rather in the low-skilled intensive sectors. However, again, we need to verify that. We need to see and to have more data on the different activities across the global value chains. The global value chains, of course, is another story. We did not see the correlation between the probability that the firm is integrated into global value chains and women employment. Yet, this is a very interesting dimension to see. What we are also considering is the gender provisions that are in the provisions now in the regional trade agreements, specifically in Europe. Are these gender provisions enforceable or not? And if yes, are they increasing the probability of the women employment or not? Again, I think the access to finance is one of the very important impediments. So in the region, the access to finance to women is 40% less than the peer regions. At the same income level. Also, the high risk perceived by women is something that decreases the access to finance. I think I covered the two questions. Yeah. And Samuel, would you like to add something?
No, go ahead.
Well, no, thank you, Yasmin. Just briefly, I think the question on infrastructure is very, very important. I think this is what we try to allude in Yasmin's first slide in the presentation. The notion of the general ecosystem for trade is very, very weak, and it really kind of inhibits the potential of trade for these countries particularly. So there are a lot of things that can be done. Infrastructure is one of them. Obviously, institution is the other one. I just came yesterday from a trip in Africa, and the potential and the opportunities are tremendous, and they are inhibited by a lot of things like infrastructure, connectivity, the digital divide, and so on. So infrastructure is obviously very key. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think the other two were sort of comment-y. So I'm just going to move to another question from online. This one is for Dr. Pallet. So you referred to green shipping corridors as part of decarbonization, but your slide also mentioned carbon pricing, which in the context of industrial and trade policy is of particular interest to my institute. I'll tell you who the institute is in a minute. Could you expand on this idea in the Asian Southeast Asian context? And that is from Alice Tipping. She is a director of trade at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Dr. Pallet?
Thank you so much, Irene, and Alice, lovely to hear from you online. This is something on which we probably have had a quick discussion earlier before, but the point that I wanted to mention over here is that when it comes to India, when it comes to Canada, and the idea of green shipping is something which can be very easily moved because both Canada and India in their own ways are engaged in this exercise. Canada has a very robust domestic rules-based framework on this. India is shaping the rules because it is working internationally with partners. India and Singapore have drafted a strong MOU on this, and there are examples of India working with Japan, Singapore, and Australia for shaping these green shipping lines in order to produce green ammonia and export it to certain ports of the region where they can be used for bunkering. But there is a question of carbon price that comes up here. And I think, Alice, you would know that when we look at the free trade agreement that's going on between European Union and India, and the point over there is that European Union is probably one of those regions of the world which has come out with an explicit pricing model of carbon. India is yet to go there, like most other countries of Southeast Asia as well. But the question is that when these pricings are taken in terms of differentials between what is domestically determined by India as far as emission pricing is concerned and what is domestically determined for emission in the European Union, might the differential actually turn out to be substantive enough to become a border barrier in some respect? I think that is a question which still continues to be a source of concern in some areas, and I'm happy to reflect much more on this and learn from your observations.
Thanks so much. I'm going to go to one more question in the room. Martha, over to you.
Thanks. Thanks. It's more of a comment than a question. I'm Martha Milles. I'm from IDRC as well. So this was triggered by one of the things that Verena emphasized in terms of, if we look at the structure of the economies, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, being largely driven by informal sector. So one of the things that we are learning from IDRC's own work around the AFC-FTA is very often for those SMEs, particularly informal SMEs, non-trade barriers are more critical than trade barriers. So, what are the ways in which, for depending on like which level of SMEs that we are concerned, so the tariffs may not be the primary driver of inclusiveness in some of the regions. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And the other thing that we're also learning is like the impact of trade on, if you're looking at the inclusive, the driving inclusive trade. So it varies whether you are employed in those sectors that are hit by tariffs in terms of employment, but also if you are more in the SME front, women as traders, the impact could be mitigated, whether you are, facilitated like value chain, up the value chain, or you're like stuck in that. And the growing inequality is something that actually is emerging as areas in which we need to disaggregate in terms of the varied layers of how we look at the inclusive trade from different angles. So just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. I don't know how we're doing on the timing for the we might move to the next section, right? We've decided to skip the health break. So sorry about that. We just wanted to make sure that we got everybody to give everybody a chance to speak, and then also respect the time of the final the end time of our session. So now we are moving on to, let me just see here. Yes, we're coming to the last section of our event, and we have three more papers to listen to. So our first speaker for this final segment is Dr. Dominique Njanku. He's the director of the African Trade and Sustainable Development, a research and advisory support NGO based in Washington, D.C. Dr. Njenku, who many of you probably know, his expertise combines policy research and providing advisory support to governments and regional economic communities on African development challenges and opportunities. And he previously served as the lead trade facilitation specialist at the World Bank, where he supported the African and Caribbean regions during the EPA and Doha round negotiations. He also supported implementation of key trade talks and agreements. So I think you're amongst friends here, Dr. Njenku. You've got a lot of former trade negotiators here. So the working title for his paper is Trade for Development Towards an Inclusive Research Agenda with Implications for Canada-Africa Trading Relations. So welcome to you.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity that is given to me to contribute to this important exercise. What I did to respond to this call is to basically ask myself, whose trade objective do we want to address? So I went to review several African trade policy statement strategies. I reached out to several African trade policy makers to learn from them where the challenge, the priorities are. I went to fellow African researchers, asking them the state of their own research that I might not know what they are doing and where they see the priorities going forward. And then I went to some of fellow trade development experts who are not necessarily Africans, but who are really doing research at the frontier. Essentially, then from this exercise, I will go right away and share with you what I see as the future priorities for research. For Africa, the framework, talking to African policymakers and researchers, is the Agenda 2063 and the Continental Free Trade Agreement, okay, which raise several opportunities and challenges, but definitely this is the first time that Africa has a framework around which everybody is discussing. I will not go into the WTO and shifting challenge that, on the second slide, please, that we have already discussed. But then I asked myself, for this exercise, what do we want to do? I would basically say, okay, from Canada, they have a comparative advantage of being an abundant resource country. They have been able to industrialize based on those natural resources. And to the contrary, Africa is also rich in natural resource, but has not been able to industrialize. So maybe I'd say the objective of this program could be basically to find mutually beneficial programs. For Canada, what I would see is basically investment opportunities and export opportunities, and especially of new technologies, because that's one of the things that Africa needs. Then for Africa, it's really an opportunity of enhance its competitiveness to trade more, boost intra-regional trade, and then export both to Canada but other developed countries. That said, compared to other regions that we have discussed earlier, in Africa, we do need to take into account that we have a problem of capacity. The research is fragmented in the sense that whenever, whatever issue you take, there are several statements or research outcomes that are presented and that are not necessarily providing the same language. Policy fragmentation is also an important element. So I would argue that in undertaking this program, it would be important to include an aspect of addressing the weak human and institutional capacity. I also would argue strongly that Africa is very diverse, as has already been said. So it would be useful to have a framework of looking at Africa, but addressing some selected rates and countries, not necessarily focusing on those that are progressing more. Next. That said, basically I have identified 3 broad areas that are called pillars that can be considered for this research program. The first is what I call inclusive trade and gender equality. I would really say that maybe it's gender, but it's really inclusion. Okay, so we have already talked about SMEs, we have already talked about informal sector, we have already talked about small landlocked economies and so on. So basically, the issue of inclusivity is an important one that we need to take into account. And then the framework for that discussion that I'm arguing is the implementation of the CFTA protocol on women and youth. But it's important to tie that with other policies on the continent that address gender or inclusion agenda. I have already talked about the policy fragmentation that we need to address. So basically, one issue that we need to do in addressing the gender and inclusion agenda is to again take into account the weak capacity that I talk about, is a program to support the full understanding of the issues. The data problems have already been identified, but there are some data out there, but we do need to have sufficiently disaggregated data that would enable us to do an intersectionality analysis to really look at the various aspects of fostering inclusion. In terms of the TOR talk about climate and change. Basically, I think I didn't cover that in this pillar, but I did cover that in the next 2 pillars, because basically, whether I talk about the pillar related to industrialization or the one related to digitalization, climate should be an integral part of it. Next, please. The second pillar of the work that I have looked at is sustainable and inclusive natural resource-based and resilient industrialization. Okay, so you see here that the idea of inclusion is built into it. The idea of having resiliency or taking into account the climate dimension is important. So what I see here as a priority research that we need to take into account is basically to look at what is it, to have a good understanding of what the developed countries are looking at in addressing trading with Africa. And then for Africa, the interest is really access to technology, value addition, and so forth. So basically, the paper has identified things that needs to be understood from the Canadian side, but also things that needs to be understood from the African side, and the kind of research that is needed on that. But in terms of the approach, I think it would be useful. Of course, the CFTA is partly negotiated, but it's not completely negotiated. We have talked about the WTO, which is in limbo. So basically, it's important to have an aspect of trade negotiation support as part of the program, because that is still ongoing. And one aspect that I have singled out in the paper is the idea of having plurilateral agreements, because basically this is a framework in the WTO where African and other developing countries are currently being excluded, and unfortunately, if they don't get more involved, they risk being marginalized going forward. So I've made a point about that, and then a critical mineral has already been suggested, and I think also then that the idea of having plurilateral agreement on critical mineral is important, because we need to have a framework in which a group of African countries can come together to negotiate with those firms and developed countries that are interested in their critical mineral. Next, please. On sustainable development, basically, I have three more additional topics that we need to consider for the research program. One is value chain analysis. I would not dwell more on that because it has already been raised by several other people. But basically, I argue in the paper that it's really important to make sure then that we have the kind of detailed analysis that will ensure then that we can have a discussion on what is needed in terms of policy support to foster backward linkages, upgrading, and so on, and then also a cross-border cooperation of firms. The third areas that I suggested here is the resiliency of the supply chain to connecting to markets. Okay, it was already mentioned in the earlier session, the importance of supply chain, transportation, and so on. So basically, I'm also saying that this is an area that we need to put some emphasis on, and then there are several issues that needs to be addressed, which are discussed in the paper, including the single window that Yasmin has mentioned. The last one on this one is green industrialization and climate smart management. Again, so these are issues that have already been mentioned by the other papers, and I think these are also important elements that would fall into the research agenda for Africa. Next, please. The last pillar that I have is on digitalization, financial innovation, and connectivity. And again, I insist here on sustainability, which basically takes me back to climate and resiliencies. And then inclusion, well, as I said, it's gender, but it also goes beyond. It's really SMEs and so on. There are four areas that I've identified broadly as research possibilities. One is basically the policy support, research and analysis to drive the digitalization on the continent, okay? Because basically there are many policies, strategies that have already discussed. There are several cost-cutting issues that needs to be considered, and I think this would be an important area to focus on, because in fact, when you look at several strategies at the national or sub-regional level and even continental level, you could easily see that digitalization is really a cross-cutting issue, because almost anybody is talking about it, and then it has implication on what you do on agriculture, climate, and things like that. The second area that I have here is the digitalization of cross-border financial payments. So basically, the point here is to nurture a well-functioning cross-border digital payments, and again, because the difficulties that we have on cross-border transaction payments on the continent, this would be an important area that we should focus on. Then next, please. The next one is the implementation of the CFTA digital trade protocol. Again, the same way I said about the women and youth protocol, there is a digital trade protocol in the CFTA. Given that the digital trade is part of most African national and sub-regional strategies, it would be an important area to focus on. The last one is cross-border data flows and digital payments, which is related to the second elements that I discussed earlier. What I'm suggesting here is that there is the Afexim Bank that is promoting the PAPS, the Pan-African Payment System, which is basically supporting the private sector and building the infrastructure to foster cross-border payments. But what is lacking is the research and policy support to accompany this data flow and payment system. So basically, I'm suggesting that this would be an important area that could be considered, because then it will serve the entire integration on the continent. So basically, those are the main areas that I suggest could be the focus of the research. And then I would conclude by insisting on what I said, is that definitely, capacity is an issue. We cannot just discuss about what issues to be discussed, but how do we support the research, and how do we ensure then that research can be used to support policy design and policy implementation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dominique. A lot to cover. I wanted to put all of your minds at ease. All of these presentations will be shared with you. So hope you're not breaking your hand by scribbling notes or typing like mad. They will be shared with you. So, and then in a few weeks, we will also share the papers with you, the full papers, once we've had the chance to, go back and do some edits and so forth. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is so vital for Africa, and IDRC is doing some work, has been doing some work for the last couple of years on the Women and Youth Protocol, and trying to work with a few countries to pilot the actual ratification of that protocol, and we're doing that with the Trade Law Center based in Cape Town, but the issue of capacity, I think, is also an issue, not just research on the numbers for trade, but also on trade itself, the capacity building of being able to be good negotiators within the AFCFTA, and making sure that the AFCFTA in relation within countries is being well understood, and the various protocols then are being monitored, well understood, ratified, and actually being used. So we have two more very exciting presentations to listen to. I know it's been a long morning, but I hope an invigorating one. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to our next presenter, Mr. Pedro da Mota Viega, who he is a co-director at the Center for Integration and Development Studies. That's an independent think tank based in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. He's his particular areas of interest and research interest include international trade, surprise, surprise, trade and investment, trade politics and negotiations, and the interface between geopolitics and international economic relations. He's worked as a consultant for several international organizations, including the OECD, the World Bank, and UNCTAD, amongst others. He's the co-authoring the paper for this series with his colleagues Sandra Rios, and the working title is Latin America, Trade Policies and the New International Scenario, Challenges and Opportunities. And Mr. Viega will be presenting in French. And so if any of you in the room like to have headphones, please just let us know. We'll bring them to you. Merci, et c'est à vous la parole, Monsieur Viega.
Thank you very much. Very much for that. I will take the advantage of the simultaneous translation, and I make my presentation in French. So, please, next slide. The presentation here is in English, but I'm making it in French, okay? Speaking French, I mean.
As you know, Latin America is heterogeneous in terms of size, economic structure, and social organization. We identified 3 international trends emerging from non-trade agendas and that are likely to strongly impact all Latin America countries, irrespective of their specificities, which are geopolitics, climate change, and digitalization. There are 3 main questions that we want to address in our paper. How do these trends affect the region's trade and investment, and what are their implications for the trade policies of Latin American countries? First question. So the impact on trade and policies. Second question. What trade-related policy responses should LATAM countries employ to address the impacts of these new issues? And the third question has to do with the way it will have an impact through trade, socio-economic groups that have a negative impact or historical negative impact due to inequalities and lack of opportunities in the region. And next slide. Now, we have the 3 trends, and it's the same structure. First of all, the vector of transmission of impacts on trade. What are the effects on trade, and what are the challenges for the region's countries? I have 10 minutes only, so I won't go over everything. But let's take an example. Let's talk about climate change. So, there's a new international model for energy changes and climate change mitigation. What is the impact on trade? Well, changes and shifts in the map of comparative advantages of different economies, favoring jurisdictions able to connect to investments associated with this energy transition. So what are the challenges for my region's countries? First of all, insertion in the new value chains associated with the energy transition. Then, attracting investments in emission-intensive industrial sectors for the use of renewable or clean energies, and then accessing export markets that impose mandatory compliance requirements based on climate criteria, TRCMs. And I'm talking about trade measures like the ones adopted by the EU recently. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, for digitalization, vector of transmission is the diffusion of a new set of technology innovations centered on digitalization. The impact on trade is to reduce informational barriers to entry into international trade, especially for small firms, and foster the setting of new value chains in goods and services. Now, challenges for these policies, be they trade policies or non-trade policies, but that are important for the future. Well, expanding and consolidating digital infrastructure, addressing domestic digital divides. It is important that we mitigate this gap that exists. Then address regulations and transborder data flows. It's important that we reduce barriers and tariffs regarding goods and services required for the energy transition that is required in the Mercosur countries. Next slide, thank you. Now, it's the same thing for the three trends we identified. So one box for each trend. So what we did is we, rotating the trends, looked at the impacts that we identified previously. And what we did is we actually outlined the details and solution that could be implemented to mitigate these issues. So, repercussion, protectionism, this is under trade. So what would be the responses? So, geographical trade diversification could be a solution, for example. This is what we heard with the Canadian strategy. And this could be supported by programs and export program and new international trade accords and tools to evaluate vulnerabilities. Venena talked about this. It is important that we are able to evaluate the vulnerabilities of the countries at hand and understand the disruption possibilities in this new protectionist environment. Japan and Australia just implemented programs with this exact goal right after the pandemic. These programs have to do with economic security. Regarding the China-US divide, that has a major impact on geopolitics. We want to deepen sub-regional integration schemes with an updated agenda and to implement agreements on sensitive goods with third countries, neither US nor China, like Chile, EU. They have an agreement on critical.
We have the same exercise on the next slide for climate change. And digitalization. I won't spend too much time on this, given the remaining time.
Next one. This one.
5 big axes of policy responses to the new scenario. The first one is addressing risks and opportunities brought by the new international scenario to historically disadvantaged socioeconomic groups, such as women and youth. Secondly, multiply international partnerships within and outside the region through trade and other thematic and sectoral agreements for critical minerals, for example. This is how we can manage the geopolitical context. Thirdly, resume the economic agenda of sub-regional integration. In the 90s and 2000, there was a period of stagnation over the last decade. Fourthly, accelerate trade facilitation in line with commitments made in the WTO TFA. Also reducing tariffs and other obstacles to trade. Fifthly, address regulatory issues directly related to trade policy to enable countries' responses to the challenges of sustainability and digitalization. For instance, the introduction emission trade schemes. The European Union and Brazil are working on this currently, and also carbon pricing mechanisms, and also updating of domestic regulations applying to energy markets and services provision, as well as cross-border data flows. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pedro, once again. It is very difficult to summarize everything in 10 minutes. I saw your article, 30 or so pages. So it's very difficult to summarize that in 10 minutes, but...
our last speaker, last but not least, and then we'll have some time for more questions and answers. So our next presenter is Dr. Mariama Williams. She is a board director at the Institute of Law and Economics in Jamaica. She's a feminist economist working on economic development, macroeconomic and trade, external debt and finance issues. And she works, her work focuses on gender equality and women's empowerment, social equity, sustainable climate finance and development, and climate change issues. She's also a member of the Caribbean Feminist Action Network, the Gender and Trade Coalition, and principal consultant for the Integrated Policy Research Institute. I had the pleasure of meeting her in July in a very hot Seville. So nice to see you on the screen there, Mariama. So she is co-authoring her paper with Rosalie Judith, who is the founder and CEO of the Institute of Law and Economics at the University of Technology in Jamaica. So welcome to you, Dr. Williams.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, and good night to those of you who are far flung away. Thank you very much. It's been a very enlightening morning. I didn't catch every single one because I had some teaching to do, but I am back, and thank you very much. I'm doing this paper with Dr. Rosalie Hamilton, who is the founder and CEO of the Institute for Law and Economics, as well as Ms. Judy Wedderburn, who was formerly executive director for Friedrich Eichberg Stiftung office in Jamaica and does a lot of work on gender and trade. I am presenting, and all mistakes are mine because I haven't yet put together all their papers that they're sending to me. They're in Jamaica currently, and I am in West Palm Beach, Florida. Fortunately for me, not having any outage or any issues of flooding, but there are various things going on, as you are aware of, in Jamaica at the moment. So thank you. So our brief was to look at the Canada-CARICOM trade. Well, we narrowed it to CARICOM. Caribbean was way too large, so we did not doing CARIFORUM. We're doing just CARICOM trade and investment. And so what we've been doing is looking at the nature of this partnership. So what I'm presenting, and hopefully you'll get the paper, at least a full draft soon enough. I apologize for not having a PowerPoint, so I'll try to speak very slow within the 10 minutes. So I'm just going to quickly go through kind of the overview of Canada-CARICOM trade and investment and how this partnership is moving forward and what it means for the region in the context in which we are. So just to situate that, Canada has 41 million people market and CARICOM has 19 million. So already you see that quite wide disparity. But the relationship is undergoing profound transformation, right? Evolving from a foundation based on non-reciprocal Commonwealth Caribbean countries tariff situation, and then the Carib-Can agreement. And now most recent evolution has been to the 2023 Canada-CARICOM strategic partnership. So this shift moves the paradigm from one of donor-recipient aid towards a multifaceted alliance grounded in mutual economic security, climate resilience, inclusive growth, as many Caribbean proponents will tell you. So this analysis that we're doing is examining the core trade dynamics, the critical role of services, financial integration, and the support structures from micro and small enterprises, which are quite different in size and scope from those in Canada and elsewhere. and the strategic opportunities and challenges that will define the future of this consequential hemispheric relationship. So just to set the table, all right, the goods trade between CARICOM and Canada is significant, but exhibit characteristics of high concentration in low value-added products and commodities from the Caribbean, which is vulnerable to external shocks, right? Total volume is upwards in 1.8 billion and using 2022 data, or 1.2 2024. And that underscores the volatility due to global commodity price and fluctuations, right? CARICOM export to Canada remains heavily concentrated in a narrow basket of primary commodities. Key exports from at least the 4 key countries are minerals, gold, and we're talking about unwrought gold, which is not, the kind that you keep as asset for the central bank, but bullions and other sorts of stuff, powder and stuff, as well as the gold for jewelry making. Aluminum, certainly from Jamaica, methanol, urea, and rum. And the modernization of the Commonwealth Caribbean countries tariff, which has been expanded to 2023 to include apparel or textile, which it didn't before, and refined sugar, provides a duty-free framework for these goods. And the aim is to stimulate diversification. At the same time, CARICOM's import from Canada, we actually take higher value-added manufacturing and process good, machinery, transportation equipment, paper products, foodstuff, and significant amount of wheat, iron, machinery, meat, and even fish, right? Looking at a 6-digit HS classification. The trade balance, which is a telling indicator of the structural imbalance in the shift in trade between the two regions. So CARICOM has historically had a surplus with Canada, and that has turned into a deficit, highlighting the region's persistent import dependence and the failure of preferential schemes alone to build resilient export capacity. If we look at some of the research coming out at the Sri Rampal Center by Bishop and others. When we look at the service sector, this is a bedrock of the relationship, right? The good trades fluctuate, but the service sector constitutes the stable and substantial core of the economic relation, totaling at least 3.9 billion in 2021. But this sector is far more nuanced than is often portrayed, right? You have the traditional service pillar, tourism, transportation, logistics, business processing, but you also have significant financial services that is deepening and being entrenched and also evolving at the same time. And so there's a strategic consolidation for Canadian banks who have kind of spread their wings into other parts of Latin America, creating a narrative about decreasing presence. But at the same time, they're deepening their commitment in terms of digital transformation, a subject that has been a source of discussion here, wealth management and corporate banking, and supporting Canadian investment. So the overall assessment is that the relationship is maturing, not so much diminishing, as Canadian banks move from a model of retail presence to one of focused value-added financial service in key CARICOM market. They still remain pillars of the financial system, crucial for stability, correspondent banking, and facilitating trade and investment flows, especially now in this time of significant shift in global trade. There's also the other area that I want to flag is the targeted support for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprise, which is a backbone of Caribbean economy. And this is part of the service direction that Canada has deployed a multi-pronged strategy to support, often linking this support to gender equality and climate resilience objectives, right? The Trade Facilitation Office recently, I think as early as February this year, talk about trade for resilient, inclusive, sustainable growth, which is launching a project to support Caribbean MSME in agri-food and creative industries, including export readiness training, e-commerce integration, and business-to-business matchmaking with Canadian buyers. We also have the local entrepreneur program, LEAP, which is focused on agri in the MSME sector. Improve access to finance is very critical in this area. So the recent launch of the relationship between the Caribbean Development Bank in terms of the portfolio guarantee of about 200 million is a powerful de-risking tool that will enable Caribbean entity, at least the CBD, to expand its lending, hopefully to the business sector, and particularly to MSME sector, particularly in renewable energy, climate smart agriculture, and logistics. What are some of the key challenges to this partnership? All right. Several persistent structural and policy changes continue to constrain the partnership. If you recall, Canada has been negotiating since 2007 a free trade agreement, so to speak, with CARICOM, which stalled in 2014 and has since not picked up any dimensions, right? Though we see some policy work being done on the ground in terms of the strategic partnership, in terms of the initial environmental assessment and some sectoral agreements. Despite that, there are some fundamental constraints having to do with the structural vulnerability of the Caribbeans and small island developing states. Small market size, limited industrial capacity, high import dependence, and acute vulnerability to climate change and external shocks, which make it difficult for CARICOM to compete on a level playing field and leverage trade agreements fully. Also limited export diversification. Even under the Commonwealth Caribbean custom tariff and its predecessors, those have failed to spur significant export diversification beyond primary commodity. And that's a testimony to what Bishop calls a deep-seated issue of productive capacity and competitiveness in the region. So we would look forward to strategic integration for the future, right? So a partnership that really responds and addresses these challenges through an integrated framework. So a gender-responsive trade and development agreement would be important, or a protocol. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But also, just to flag, that's one. The other area that needs to be looked at is the small island developing states' FIT rules of origin, right? Because despite the fact that we have unilateral preferential agreement, those do not extend cumulatively to all of the Caribbean, and it extends to about 60% of value added. And that's a significant constraint, the lower value added threshold and the need for special provisions for women and implementation of digital self-certification. Those kinds of things are important. So we need to see some shift in the rules of origin that makes it more fit for SIDS as we look forward to. I think we need to expand the service chapter in any future agreement, right? For there to be explicit provision for mutual recognition of professional credentials under Mode 4, especially nurses, ICT cooperation, and some of the digital economy rules. There's also a scope for operationalizing a resilience facility concept that would create a joint government mechanism to strategically blend Canada's financial tools to co-finance projects that are both climate resilient, such as renewable microgrids, port retrofits, and inclusive women-led create job using gender performance metrics. I think some of this at the sectoral levels, what we're seeing and what people are in the literature is arguing is that it needs to be a shift from moving from traditional sectors and to begin to target digital service and fintech, leveraging Canada's expertise and Caribbean talent to develop regional fintech hubs, to move into more of what's called the orange and the green economy, scaling up the creative industries, music, film design, and the sustainable blue economy, marine technology, sustainable fisheries, and the care economy, investing in trading services related to climate resilient childcare, elder care, and sectors that employ many women and enables broader economic participation. And to that extent, we need to leverage the financial service partnership between Canada and CARICOM and forge a new partnership that would allow for some specifics. So let me shift now. I really want to flag through some of the policy implications of where we're going when we look at the dynamics towards trade and development agreement with Canada. So basically, based on the situation currently and trying to promote Caribbean resilience in a climate and a just transition framework, we would like to see, and we're arguing, and we will argue and try to bring evidence, and we're inferring at this moment, but we're looking for targeted data, so that we need to make climate resilience integral to market access, right? And we could use the Canada's initial environmental assessment within the 2023 strategic partnership to argue for an agreement that whose architecture embed resilience, adaptation, cooperation, SIDS flexibility, and gender across chapters, not as a side MOU. So we, thinking of having a climate resilient trade protocol, and next with expedited customs for relief supplies, for green tech tariff preferences, port, warehouse hardening support, things like that. As we've seen with Melissa, which has really attacked what is Jamaica's heartbeat. This is a food. St. Elizabeth is our food, is a parish that produces significant amount of the foods in the region, in Jamaica. So that will have significant implication, not just for day-to-day food, but also for our export basket. So this idea of having green tech tariff preference and port and warehouse hardening support is critical. We need to preserve and upgrade the unilateral preferences while negotiating leverage. Now we know that there's been an expansion of the Commonwealth Caribbean custom tariff, but also would like to see a more simplified origin, right? Simplified origin calibrated to SID scale cumulation. Currently, we'd like to see that the rules of origin allows cumulation across Caribbean island and allows for greater uptake of different goods and increase the value, the proportion of the value added. That would be part of any upgrading. That would enable us to stimulate light manufacturing in agri-food export, and it could link to women's own MSME in our future going forward. And that Canada could use the money that's already pledged to CBD to backstop facilities that co-finance renewable storage, energy efficiency for tourism and health, climate smart agriculture, and digital trade rails. So we're pairing trade facilitation reform kind of with result-based climate finance, if you will. And there's a big question mark about that, but it's something to examine. Another area of cooperation that needs to be projected in the future is around data and standard cooperation. So a nice Canadian CARICOM data working group to look at services trade gaps in tourism, the BPO, and ICT, and to align green product standards and MRV for low carbon supply chain would be very useful in the future going forward. And as I highlighted in my initial introduction, just transition is an important framework that we need to fold into any SIDS, and particularly any Caribbean SIDS trade agreement, to tie all the cooperation to gender responsive program. Some of the existing portfolio shows precedent with women-led enterprises window and skill credential portability for digital service, and a whole host of other things that could be put in to negotiating or thinking about if the starting point is the 2023 agreement, and these are things that we could build up and integrate into that discussion. That we know for sure that the WTO has expanded the CARICOM to, I think, 2033. So the waiver is there. And there's been an expansion of the CCC to include textiles and apparel, and those are very good step in the right direction. But now we need to focus it some of this discussion on climate resilience and gender responsivity. We know that within the Caribbean context, Caribbean has been expanding and opening up, right? Even before this drama with the US, it's been extending its relationship with Africa through the African Export-Import Bank, which now has at least 3 or 4 countries in the region and significant amount of flow, dynamic flow. And I think given Canada's also its outreach to Africa, there is some possibility there for some inter-regional, cross-regional linkages that to expand the flow of relationship and trade in a triangular way, Africa, Caribbean, Canada. I'm going to stop there and wait for some questions.
Yeah. Thank you. We don't have much time for questions left, unfortunately. I will take maybe one, because we still want to have some closing remarks from our Vice President, Maggie Gorman-Velez. Let me just see here. There was one for LATAM. I don't know who's written the question, but I guess this must be maybe for Pedro. What is the role of violence and illegal economies in this trade scenario, and how is this a challenge, and what type of challenge is it? Alors, quel est le rôle de la violence et des économies illégales dans
What is the role of violence and illegal economy in this trade scenario, and how is this a challenge? What type of challenge?
And is there a question maybe in the room, or should we just go to that one? And we've got also something for Dominique if we've got, no minutes left. I'll pass it to you, Pedro.
Merci, Erin.
Thank you.
Quel est le rôle de la violence dans ce scénario? La violence
Violence and organized crime have always existed in Latin America. So yes, of course, it is important. It impacts the various countries, but countries didn't find the right solution to tackle this issue. It's a very complex issue, this being said. International trade is in part illegal trade. So drugs, but also products that are not used in their legal way and that are exported, like timber and wood. Illegal exports of wood happens in a region. I don't know if there's an intersection to evoke. I don't know if I'm able to answer the question, but I would say that yes, there is some of it. The international trade of illegal products or illegal trade of legal products are intertwined with policies.
The slides, those that gave presentations, will be shared with you, and the papers will also be shared. You'll need to give us a few weeks, because I think the authors are going to kind of come back together after this session and digest some of your questions as well, and then make some edits, and so you can just hang on for all of that.
Please note that those who weren't able to join us today and those who presented today will share their articles. We will receive a final version in December.
So the insights gathered from these scoping papers are really what are going to help inform IDRC's research initiative in the years to come. And so it has been and it continues to be such an interesting discussion for us as we start to understand where really are the most priority areas. There's so many overlaps that we've seen now, the digital space of course, climate change, women's economic empowerment within a trade situation. How do we measure that? What are the policies that could actually encourage that, and how do we collect the data on that? So, but ultimately, our goal as IDRC is, of course, to support action-oriented research and to inform inclusive and sustainable trade policies in the Global South. So that's, of course, policies that maximize employment and business opportunities for women and young people, while also promoting environmental sustainability in these very complex geopolitical times. So with that,
and now I would ask Maggie Garland-Villis, Vice President for Regions and Policies at the IDRC. She will conclude this meeting.
Merci, Erin, and what an excellent half day I think we've had here today. And I have the immense pleasure to thank everyone and express my sincere appreciation on behalf of IDRC to our distinguished speakers here in the room today, but also online, including those who stayed up very late to join us and share their insights with us. I'd like to also thank the members of the diplomatic community who joined online, our Government of Canada colleagues, researchers, and interested participants. Your insights today have really enriched our discussions, and as Erin has said, will inform our research agenda going forward.
I have learned a lot through the discussions today, and I hope you were able to gather insights, ideas, and a renewed determination. The messages were clear. Our goal is not only to promote trade, it is also to understand how trade can work out for everyone. This shift allows us to go beyond economic transactions and to try to obtain inclusive results and just results.
A couple of reflections that I had personally as I was listening to the conversations today. I mean, first of all, at a time when Canada is reconciling how the broader tools in its foreign policy toolkit can align and reinforce its diversification of trade goals, it really strikes me how important it is to bring globally connected research and sense-making to bear so that we're moving ahead in really an informed way going forward. And second, across the presentations, I was really happy, despite what is often a gloomy and very negative discourse around what's happening in the world today, to hear many tangible areas where we could indeed create shared benefit between Canada and low and middle income countries that we're going to be working with more closely that promote growth, but also think about that longer term trajectory that Santiago mentioned at the outset, understanding what the benefits are for all parts of our citizenry, and also thinking about the sustainability of trade. So as Canada continues to define its action, we're really excited to bring research to bear on these elements to inform our way forward. Sur notre lancée,
so let's keep the momentum going. Please stay in touch. This workshop marks the beginning of a journey, one that we hope to continue with you through collaboration, shared learning, and joint action. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
On behalf of IDRC, have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Just one last thing. If I know that many of your questions weren't answered and so on, but so if you have further input, you can email our team, which is sie@idrc.ca. So maybe that'll be just put into the chat, so we can keep the conversation a little bit alive. Thank you.